Okay. Good morning, good morning. Thank you, everyone. I think most people have come in. My name is Margo. I'm with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and I thank you so much for coming out today after a few days of our first rain and making it out to our first in-person event. We're very honored to have you all here, and to the live stream audience, thank you for bearing with us for a little bit of delay as we get people settled and in. Just protocol, as you probably see, we cannot have open drinks in the auditorium, but the coffee and tea will be served throughout in the lobby area, and we encourage you in the second session to also partake of pastries, coffee, tea, and go around and circulate and talk to all our table exhibitor and hosts. The Center for Creative Land Recycling is about a 23-year organization based here in Berkeley, and we are very proud to help assist and guide applicants and nonprofits, municipalities, and tribes in their work to remediate, revitalize, and create new uses on brownfield properties. As you can see, we are technical assistants on behalf of US EPA and the Department of Toxic Substance Control on their special grant program, which you'll be hearing about later. So the format today is we're going to have some very wonderful welcomes and keynote speakers. We'll then go to a formal panel called Environmental Justice and the Built Environment. After that, we'll have a very interactive session for those on live stream. You will just see a static slide during that because it is a lobby-based activity. And then the third panel will be a very important one on resources and funding. So we hope those in the live stream will stay with us and just take a break during session 2. So these are our first panels. I want to first have the honor to introduce Martha Guzman to come up and give some initial remarks. Martha is the Regional Administrator for EPA Region 9, and followed by David Ralston of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Thank you very much, Martha.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in person, and for those of you live streaming as well. My name is Martha Guzman. I'm the Regional Administrator for EPA Region 9, and for many of you, or it sounds like most of you are very familiar with our work, but for some of you who don't know, it's a pretty large territory. It has Arizona, Nevada, California, of course, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands, and 148 federally recognized tribes. And of course, we know there's many more tribes, but federally recognized. So I wanted to just be here because I want to thank you all for your work. It's Earth Day Eve, and you guys are doing the most important work related to Earth Day. You're literally healing the earth in the communities that have been most disenfranchised by our land use policies and every other historical and racist policy that has driven the outcomes that we have today. So I want to thank you. I am very excited about the federal funding that we have to invest. I'm lucky to be in this role with funding. I mentioned earlier, I've been in previous roles in governments where we're cutting. So having $1.5 billion over the next 5 years for brownfields is really exciting. And my job is to make sure that it's done in an equitable way. And we have, of course, President Biden's Justice 40 executive direction that at least 40% of all of our funding go to the most disadvantaged, environmentally disadvantaged low-income communities. And we have an advantage in California of the EnviroScreen and other tools like the environmental indicators tool, very specific to Oakland, where we can identify where the money needs to be prioritized. So I have the funnest job. You've done all the work. You know where the communities are, you know what the investments are, and I really do feel a sense of hope just meeting some of the folks outside and your work and dedication. I know some of you from the past in my particularly in my California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation days, where we had taken on Stanislaus County for some of their redlining, and particularly on basic infrastructure. And at that point, we had redevelopment funds that they had settled, and then redevelopment got taken away. So I know this is a really long battle that you guys have here, and I just really want to thank you for that. It's incredible. It's the most important work that we can recognize during Earth Day, and your service here, obviously taking the time to take it further, is the best way to honor the Earth. So thank you very much. I think you guys know NOVA, but if you ever need to get a hold of us, let's taking all this work to the next level. NOVA is here, and I'm just across the bridge. I am based in Sacramento, but I come over to the city quite often. So please let us know how we can help, and thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Now I'd like to call David Ralston up. David and I go back for many years that he worked in Oakland, in Central, Far East, and West Oakland, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome him to do some remarks from his new role as Senior Advisor in the Bay Area Air Quality Management District.
I get to take off the mask. All right, hello, good morning, everybody. Good to see you. I'm so excited just to be here and our first live event since COVID, and to see Margo after all these years. So it's an honor, and thank you, Martha, for reminding us about Earth Day. I have to go plant some trees tomorrow, so I'll be up again early. But I'm very excited to be here and make some remarks as a planner with the Air District. I also have a background in redevelopment planning with Oakland, as Margo said. But you might be asking, why is somebody from Air here talking about brownfields? Well, there are three things that I'll highlight. First of all, when Margo asked to talk about environmental justice, I want to jump at that opportunity. My passion for environmental justice, my interest, that's something that goes back, let me date myself here, about 30 years when we had the first people of color greening conferences here in Berkeley in the 90s, all the way up to my current work with the Air District with SB 1000 and the environmental justice elements that many of you know. Second, air, land, water, all of these issues are really intertwined. And when we talk about health and wellness, we're talking about whole systems, we're talking about being whole. So, a case in point is, if some of you remember a few years ago when Phillips 66 had the oil spill in the bay and, damaged all the, threatened the bay ecosystems. Well, of course, that also created all these odors that affected the whole North Bay, and people had to shelter in place. And so the air, the water, these things connect. When you have a point source of pollution, it may be going up into the air, but then the hydrocarbons, the sulfur, the nitrogens, the metals, the acids, the VOCs, all these are going to deposit into the soil. They're going to come down to the local community, and that's going to be an issue. So we can't take these apart. They are all intertwined together. And of course, you all know that, and that's why, as part of environmental justice, we need to talk about these together. Thirdly, in my work, I've really been inspired by co-beneficial green infrastructure projects and trying to find solutions that engage neighborhoods that can solve a lot of these problems at the same time. So I've actually had the opportunity across the East Bay to be involved in reclamation projects, from the Richmond Greenway project, reclaiming the Santa Fe Railroad line that's become this amazing community park. Yeah. With the Carl Anthony and the late Carl Lynn, if any of you have known Carl Lynn, we used to do community gardening right here in Berkeley and Oakland, and reclaiming vacant lots and turning them into community gardens. So that was something I was involved in for a long time. And most recently, I've been working in San Leandro and Oakland, reclaiming the concrete channel of the San Leandro Creek and turning it into a community greenway, and really changing something that's been a barrier to communities, disadvantaged communities, from resources in their neighborhood and turning that into an asset, which is also what we want to focus on: environmental justice, removing the harms, and also increasing the benefits so everybody can enjoy in them. So finally, to frame our conversation a little bit today, I really wanted to ask the question, as we remediate and reclaim local lands, what is going to be the recycled use? What's going to be the reuse of it? Are we going to go back to the same economic paradigm that we had that created the problems, or are we going to look for something that can actually help our commons, our civic stewardship, our public space, and give back? And thanks, Rob, for the reference for the connections between building the commons and health and wellness that we need to establish. You know, there's a site in Oakland, the famous, infamous GE site that's been, I think it was a Superfund site, a polluted site. And many of the people in the community who've been trying to see this turn into something positive probably didn't realize that it's now being transformed by the city. So there's a question, what is the outreach? What is the use? Is it going to be another distribution warehouse for Amazon, you know, taking over our landscapes? Or will it be a park or something that will benefit the community? So we really need to be creative. We need to think about how these uses are going to reinvest in the community, re-engage folks. What's the return for the community and the benefits, as I mentioned? What are the cultural benefits of these projects? So this is an EJ frame. And finally, let me just say something about just transition. In my work with the Air District, we've already seen a lot of changes and interest in what's happening now with the post-industrial landscapes in our environment. So on the peninsula, if any of you know Lehigh Cement, it's one of the largest cement producers, I think, at least in the region, that's produced a lot of dust. So finally, I think the San Mateo Council are trying to purchase that site and then turn it into a regional park out there. Right here close here in Oakland, the foundry, AB&I Foundry, which has been releasing hexavalent chromium and phenolic acids to the community for decades, is finally going to move to Texas, which is on one hand is sad because they're going to take the pollution probably to less resource communities, black and brown communities in Texas. But we're getting questions, what's the decommissioning process? What's the role of the Air District going to be as these lands turn over? And that's something, you know, that's not part of our mandate, and that's a new question that we have to think about. And also we hear this in the refinery quarters in Contra Costa County. You know, these oil companies are facing a lot of pressure to change, find new niches. What happens if and when they were to leave to the legacy land uses, the pollutions? Who's going to support the workers in just transition? So this is something that we all need to think about together as we enter this new era. So I'm going to leave it with that. We have a very exciting panel here. I'm excited to hear from everybody. I'm excited to be here. So thank you very much, Margo, and I will turn it back to you guys and look forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. You brought up a lot of big issues and questions that you can actually think about, especially on the panel one that's coming up. And there'll be time for discussion and questions at that time. I'd like to ask Trina Villanueva to come to the stage. Trina is one of CCLR's, Center for Land Recycling's first early employees, and now with Union Bank, and she will introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you, Trina.
Thank you, Margo. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all here today. It is, like many, my first in-person event. And I really want to thank the team over at CCLR for inviting me to join your program today. I'm thrilled to have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker this morning, Mitchell Schwartzer. I hope I said that correctly. Professor of Urban Studies at the California College of the Arts and author of the newly published book, Hella Town, Oakland's History of Development and Disruption. So again, I'm Trina Villanueva, and I'm a Corporate Social Responsibility Officer at MUFG Union Bank. Our foundation supports local community programs that expand access to opportunity in low to moderate income communities. 90% of our philanthropic investments are devoted to our 4 strategic areas: affordable housing, economic development, social services, and sustainability. I'm proud to share that we have supported CCLR annually since 2004. Why? Simply put, no one else does what CCLR does. And also, their work cuts across all of our strategic priorities. CCLR's work, which is rooted in helping communities deal with brownfields, is at the intersection of economic development, environmental justice, and climate resilience. CCLR believes that transformation happens at the community level, and I couldn't agree more. You see, about 25 years ago, my first job out of graduate school was to work on this issue I knew nothing about called brownfields. I worked at the Greenlining Institute, and I think I actually met Ignacio 25 years ago. And if you look for a picture of him back then, he will look exactly the same as he does today. Anyway, my job at Greenlining was to work with community organizations across the state to make sure that they understood what this issue was about, because most often, they were actually the people who lived next to brownfield sites. So back then and now, with CCLR's work, we understand that keeping residents at the center of brownfields redevelopment, providing them the necessary resources, training, and technical assistance, make sure that they have well-informed decisions and ensure that the community benefits from the redevelopment projects. So again, I want to thank CCLR for inviting me today, as this is important for Union Bank as it is for me personally. Now let me tell you a little bit about our keynote speaker. Mitchell Schwartzer has had an impressive 40-year career. He's an historian whose research interests and classes cover architecture, urbanism, landscape, infrastructure, and art. He has written 5 books and over 125 articles and has had speaking engagements around the world. He's had a remarkable trajectory. From a city planner in San Francisco in the early 80s, he was actually one of the authors of the Downtown Plan, to getting a PhD in architecture and urban history at MIT in 1991, to becoming a professor, an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and now a professor at the California College of the Arts. When you get a chance to read his bio, you will see the range of topics of his published writings. His recent book, Hellatown, I believe is available here or definitely at local bookstores. Today, we will hear about the development of the transportation infrastructure in the East Bay, to the suburbanization of South Alameda County, and the demographic changes that have followed. We will also hear about what should happen along this old industrial corridor. So without further ado, everyone please welcome Mitchell Schwartzer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trina. Thank you, Margo, for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here. I knew it would be a good day when it was pouring rain all night. I feel good. What I would like to do is I'd like to talk about, I'd like to start off talking about the East Bay geography. I mean, we basically live in an environment with four generalizable districts: the waterfront, the flatlands, the lower hills, and the upper hills, and this extends across the East Bay. And if you look at the history of urban development, and I'm going to focus on the era post-Ohlone, Mexico, and Spanish, so the era after the 1850s, you can see the degree to which transportation and innovations and economic changes have really transformed each of those zones. From the 1850s to the 1890s, an era of horse transport, where most development was along the small areas of the waterfront and flatlands, to the 1890s, roughly to the Second World War, when electric traction streetcars and interurbans expanded development dramatically along the entire waterfront and almost all of the flatlands, and started the development of the lower hills. And then after 1945, when the automobile takes over pretty much, and then eventually the freeway system is built and its adjunct, the BART system, we really see the development of the upper hills and then the suburbs beyond. So 4 zones. And if you look at these zones, one sees that as you go up in elevation, you see a predominant residential pattern. You know, you don't really see a lot of commerce and certainly very little industry. The big exception is University of California, Berkeley, which extends all the way from the flatlands to the upper hills. It's really the only institution that does so. It's really, and you also see, as you go uphill in elevation from the waterfront to the upper hills, you see an increase in income levels and wealth, and you also see populations that are much more largely white and increasingly Asian, as compared to the lower hills where you see recent immigrant communities, mainly from East Asia and Latin America, and a large black population. I'd like to focus on the waterfront and the flatlands today because that's really where the brownfield sites are, and that's probably, if you look at the East Bay historically over this, let's say, 150, 170-year period, that's the area that really has changed the most and really suffered the most disturbances by far. It all begins, of course, famously when the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, and its western terminus is Oakland Point, which is now kind of lost to us, that epical site. It's where the BART train goes underground on your way to San Francisco. That's pretty much where Oakland Point is. But that's where the railroad ended. That's where Long Wharf was. That's where the Southern Pacific Mole was. Moles are trestles that extend into the bay that bring rail lines, either railroads or streetcars, out into the bay as far as possible, so then there can be a transfer to a ferry, which will then take one to San Francisco. And that was the way you got to San Francisco from New York or from Berkeley, depending where you were coming from. You went by train, some version of rail, to the ferry to complete your journey. Industry develops along the rail lines and the rail spurs. So when we talk about the great industrial era, we're talking largely about the 1880s to the 1945-ish, right? And that will start to change a lot and collapse in the 1960s. So it's a long period. The big impetus was the San Francisco earthquake. The second was the First World War, and then the Second World War. The World Wars were great for Bay Area industry, especially shipbuilding. Right? And shipbuilding really has not been much of an employment force here outside of those large wars. Pretty much the kinds of brownfields that we're talking about that are a large topic of the conference, they all date from this period, from the very late 19th century, right, and the early 20th century to the 1950s, right? And this is, anything from Clorox to shredded wheat, to the General Electric site on International and 55th Avenue that was mentioned today. These sites date from that area, and this is the great era of large-scale employment in the East Bay, in good industrial jobs. This is an era when working-class housing was built for people who worked in those industrial plants. It's almost inconceivable today to imagine that kind of situation, but that's the way things were. It's also an era when the East Bay was largely white, and we're talking 95 to 97% white across from Oakland, Alameda, up to Richmond. There was a relatively small non-white populations, but that really starts to change in 1940 with the onset of the Second World War, where you get the Great Black Migration. And Richmond and Oakland in particular, Berkeley somewhat, the populations of African Americans increased from 2% to almost 50% in 40 years. Huge changes. And then that's followed, right, in the 1970s and 80s by an enormous migration that is still ongoing from Latin America and East Asia, which has made the East Bay's population extraordinarily diverse. Whereas in the early industrial era, the streetcars and railroads and interurbans were really the kind of impetus for industrial development. What happened is industrial development, which was concentrated in downtown Oakland, a little bit around around West Berkeley, expands dramatically when you move from horse cars and a concept of the walking city, a city really of slow transportation. It's hard to commute, to streetcars and then railroads where you can commute much longer distances. And people often think of suburbanization as a residential phenomenon. It really starts with industry. Industry is the first major use to start expanding out away from the old historic downtowns. And the reason is they want larger plots of land. And they want to be where the railroads are and where the water is, right? They want to be where rail meets sail. That was and then eventually sail changes to steam power. And the like. For the same reasons that industrial development occurs along the entire waterfront, up from Richmond all the way down to Alameda and Oakland, because of rail, it starts to have problems after the Second World War, where automobiles really start to become the dominant mode of transportation. This is already present in the 1920s, but the Great Depression and Second World War put a temporary hiatus on the ascendancy of the automobile, although the Bay Bridge and Golden Gate Bridge in 1936, 1937 really changed things. From that point on, rail doesn't go by ferry anymore to San Francisco. You go on the lower deck of the Bay Bridge. The ascendancy of the automobile, I'd say in the late 40s, and then the creation of the freeway system in the Bay Area, which is from about 1948 to the early 1970s. You see all of the freeways built. It does for industry what rail had done earlier. It allows it to go much further out, much further afield, predominantly to South County. And so you start to see industry moving out. You start to see the old plants, which don't have a lot of space, and they want larger sites because everything is automotive. They need parking spaces. They need areas for truck lifts and container bays. So industry will start to move south, like the auto plants. Oakland once had 3 large auto assembly plants, Fagile and 2 General Motors plants. They all moved south to Fremont and to Newark, and Ford plant in Richmond moved south to Milpitas. So there's an era starting in around 1960 that continues to the end of the century of deindustrialization, where most of these great industries that had been the employment mainstay for East Bay working classes leave the inner East Bay. They leave Richmond. The great shipyard, the great Kaiser shipyards close shortly after the Second World War. They leave the East Bay and they move to South County. They move to other states, and they move eventually across the globe, right, to where labor is less expensive. And so we are faced with a new kind of situation, right, where the flatlands are deindustrialized, the commercial corridors are depopulated or decommercialized by another phenomenon in large part called redlining. The same working class neighborhoods where people of color lived were classified as red according to the federal government's zoning risk maps for banks. There were 4 zones: red, yellow, green, and blue. The red zones were deemed hazardous risk and got very little loans. And so there was great deinvestment along the flatland waterfront corridor. So you're seeing 2 phenomena: deindustrialization, the industries are leaving, and the flatlands are not receiving loans for residential improvements as well as commercial improvements. So the kind of ghettoization or decline of a lot of flatland neighborhoods really is attributable to these factors. And then we see the industry, a lot of industrial plants abandoned, and what becomes what I would call, since the 1990s, an era of reuse, right? What happened? I think this will be a large part of the topic today. What do you do with this land? And what we see is interesting, I think. We see several things. One, the Port of Oakland, right? Port of Oakland, the container port is a phenomenon of the 1960s and beyond, as well as the airport, which really builds way out on landfill. And there were other plans to build much further out, both in Berkeley, Oakland, and elsewhere, which would have almost extinguished a lot of the bay lands. A third of the bay was already lost. There would have been another third lost had BCDC not been established by 1970. So we see a lot of waterfront land taken for port uses, mainly in Richmond and Oakland. We see some ongoing industrial activity at a lot of these sites, although every year you hear about one or two closing, like this steel plant that just closed, glass plant closed recently. We see commerce, attempts at commerce like Jack London Square, which have mixed results, the attempt to create a kind of shopping district in Jack London Square. We see residential, like Richmond's Marina Bay is probably the great example, as well as all the projects in Jingletown, loft conversions of old industrial buildings. We see cultural uses like the Rosie the Riveter Historical Cultural Park in Richmond. We see a lot of recreation, East Bay State Park, the Berkeley Marina, which dates from the 1990s, Middle Harbor Shoreline Parkland in Oakland. We see something like Point Isabel, which is a really kind of interesting mixed use. You've got a U.S. postal warehouse distribution center alongside a Costco, alongside a regional dog park. So I think if you look at the possibilities for what's going to be happening for this broad waterfront industrial corridor, it's going to be like that list I just gave you. Lots of different things, lots of things that are mixed together. There isn't going to be one silver bullet that says, oh, this is what we can do with industrial land. And I want to emphasize again in closing that the industrial lands of the waterfront are by far the most transformed and disturbed areas of the East Bay. The upper hills are probably the least, where we actually have some actual existing a lot of native plant communities up in the very far upper hills. And as you go down the hills, as I talked about at the very beginning, you see transformation, a lot of development, a lot of disruption. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. That was fabulous. And I wanted to point out I have a personal copy you can look through over at the CCLR table, and also some flyers. It's great to see also the photographs in the book and to relive this history from a visual sense. Thank you all for your patience. I want to also note that we have biographies on our website of all of our speakers and special guests, so I will sort of shortcut some of the introductions. I'd like to begin our first panel and invite the panelists. Joanna Jensen from PlaceWorks is going to be our moderator. You will see a description on your agenda, and the agendas that will be the live stream audience can see. So for this panel, I'd like to invite the panelist, James Becker from Richmond Community Foundation, to come to the table. Joanna can come here to the podium. Diana Perez Domentic, say that right? Thank you. Apologies. From the City of Oakland, city planner, and Maribel from EJ Solutions. Is she here? Maribel? Maybe you can just present her slides for us if she hasn't made it. Sophie McGinnis, who is a planner with Alameda County Planning Department. And Jody London. Jody might be arriving just a little bit late, I believe. So we welcome our panelists. And is Joanna here? Okay. Well, let me just make a few remarks on behalf of, as an introduction to this panel. We've described it to note that, of course, the topic of brownfields is essentially begins with the earth, the ground, and the built environment. The state of California passed Senate Bill SB 1000 some years ago, which mandates that environmental justice be incorporated into all cities and municipalities' general plans and elements of the general plan. So beginning with that earlier period, I want to note the PlaceWorks as well as CJA. I think we have Joanna coming up. Thank you, yeah. were essential in helping get some of the technical tools, information tools. Joanna, if you'd like to come up here to the podium, I will have you remain here, at the main podium.
All right. Thank you so much, Margo. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. My name is Joanna Jansen, and I am a principal with PlaceWorks. We are a consulting firm here in the Bay Area. I've been working on community engagement and long-range planning issues here in the East Bay for a little bit over 20 years now, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you today. This first panel is going to introduce you to a range of professionals that are working to improve environmental justice in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. These speakers represent the full breadth of and the complicated history of the different industrial and agricultural and residential environments that we have here in the East Bay. We're going to hear about their ideas and approachings ranging from very site-specific financing tools to citywide mapping efforts to long-range countywide planning and policy efforts. And these speakers you're going to hear throughout these remarks how these speakers are working to come up with innovative solutions to address the most pressing environmental justice issues in the East Bay, not only for transitioning former brownfield sites, but for doing so in ways that also advance other very important goals of addressing historical inequities, providing affordable housing, and having co-benefits with climate resilience and community health. Throughout these presentations, I think one thread that we're going to hear over and over again, and certainly something that I know has been important in my work in these communities, is really how we can connect with, and listen to, and learn from the residents of these communities who are directly impacted by these issues that we're talking about today, and how we can learn from the creativity, the resilience, and the pride that these residents have had, even as they bear the burdens of pollution, neglect, discrimination, and racism for generations. So with that, it is my honor to introduce our speakers for this morning. We have Jem Becker, who is the president and CEO of the Richmond Community Foundation. We have Sophie McGinnis from Alameda County. And we have Diana Perez-Dominich from the city of Oakland. Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to start the presentation.
Thank you so much. How's that sound? Can you hear me okay? All right, great. Thank you. So if you were to ask me what the two most critical issues are that are facing our communities, I would respond this way. It's housing justice and it's environmental justice. And these two systems have made significant advances over the past years, but it's not often that we work together. Now, housing advocates, like me, I come from the housing side, we often focus on increased affordability and increased supply. And a lot of my colleagues who work in the environmental justice system often focus on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and energy savings. Now, there's lots of other things that come into that, but those are some of the main two. Now, housing projects can take years to develop, right? We know that. There's all kinds of things that go into it. And when you finally get everything ready and you're looking at affordable units, neighbors rise up and they push back. So that it's challenging. At the same time, in the environmental effort, green gas reductions, greenhouse gas reductions, can take a long time to manifest, right? They take time. So, but let's be honest. Right now, even the solutions in both fields are expensive, right? There's costs involved. Just look at what it costs to have a Tesla, or look what it costs if you want to put solar on a house. It's not cheap. But if housing and the environment are so important, then everybody needs access to these solutions. Not just the wealthy, not just the folks, as our prior speaker mentioned, not just the folks who live up in the hills, they're the more undisturbed parts, but everybody needs that. Now, as I mentioned, much of my career has been focused on housing, and someone once asked me that if I had a superpower to impact housing, what would that superpower be? And I thought about it for a minute, and then it hit me. I wanted the power of Oprah. I wanted to be able to work with communities and stand up and say, you've got housing, and you've got housing, and you've got housing, and people would have housing, right? Oprah did that on her show all the time with cars and all kinds of stuff. Why not housing? But I don't have that superpower. However, what I do have is an incredible group of people that I get to work with every day. People like Alvin Lewis, who's over in the corner there, who's on the foundation team. People like Nova Blage, who's our EPA person that we get to work with. People who are much smarter and more creative than I am, truthfully, and who can think holistically about these issues. So our team created a pilot project that for 5 years has produced some pretty good results and has been an effort to bring housing justice and environmental justice together. Now, our problem in the city of Richmond was that we had just a few hundred boarded up abandoned homes in the city. These homes, just like many urban cities, were created or became the way they were because of redlining and because of disinvestment and the removal or the deindustrialization of cities like Richmond, kind of like the prior speaker referenced. These properties become magnets for illegal dumping. They become health issue challenges, right? They become real problems, and they destroy the fabric of neighborhoods, right? When you've got boarded up abandoned homes in your neighborhood, what kind of level of pride is that? You know, A, that's allowed to happen, and B, that we allow people to live in those kinds of conditions. So, they're expensive again, right? It was costing the city of Richmond $7,000 per year per house just to keep them boarded up. That's about $1.5 million every year just to let things rot. But I knew that if we could acquire those, if we could rehab them, they would be a source of housing that we could get back into the market fairly quickly, right? Think about it. They're already zoned for housing. There would be no anticipated NIMBY issues. And the city would actually have someone paying all of those code enforcement fees and tax liens that are on the property that nobody pays unless someone picks up the property. You'd think the private sector would be all over this, flipping them, making lots of money, and yet it doesn't happen. So why not? Well, the properties come with lots of problems. If the owners are deceased, someone has to probate those properties to bring them to public sale. They have to pay those court fees, and that costs money. Money you might not recoup if you're not the successful bidder in the public sale. So private flippers won't do that. They're not going to lose 7 or 10 grand for the off chance they might be able to buy a house. Okay? They often also have significant tax and code enforcement issues. They've got blight issues, and truthfully, the private sector doesn't get into these because they can't make a profit. The cost to clean them up and rehab them exceeds the 40 to 50% return that most investors who flip houses want to try to recoup. So with this great group of people, we came up with an idea. We would create an investment tool that would appeal to institutional investors by offering a small rate of return, which, like any investment, was actually not guaranteed, but with a large social impact. So we would measure things like increases in affordable home ownership, increases in property values, increases in tax payments, etc. And we would use this capital to take on the city's most challenging properties. So we created a social impact bond that we sold on the investment market. In our pilot, the city of Richmond was the conduit issuer of the bond. They didn't have to pay it back, right? If the project went south, the investor actually took that risk. We at RCF Connects, we at the Community Foundation, we acted in typical bond terms as the borrower. So we were the borrower, and then we went looking for investors. We offered a bond with a 5-year term and a 2% interest rate, at the end of which the investor would receive the return of their principal and the 2%, assuming everything went to plan. What we got from the investors, and Mechanics Bank actually stepped up, a local bank, and they said, we'll take the whole bond. We got a 0% interest rate and a split if there was any profit. Bank would take half, we would take half, we would put our half back into the project, and actually the bank put their half back into the project. So that was kind of cool. And Union Bank was our trustee. So Union Bank stepped in and said, we'll be the bond trustee. We'll do that for you. So after 5 years of the pilot, we now have investors waiting in the wings. I'll get to that more in a bit, but that's exciting. So we tackled the housing part of this equation, right? We were creating a supply of affordable home ownership, but the majority of properties that we were able to acquire were built between 1920 and 1940. That was Richmond's big surge. So they were old, they had a lot of issues, and they were not the most energy efficient, to be honest. Most of them had no insulation, single pane windows. The wall heaters, you know, those gas wall heaters that are not efficient at all and cost a whole lot of money to turn on. And they were contaminated with lead paint, asbestos, and as I mentioned before, lots of illegal dumping. And then a light bulb went off. Our team realized that these might qualify as brownfields, and they did. And we began to wonder what else we could leverage. We applied for an EPA brownfield assessment grant in partnership with the city of Richmond, and we were successful, and we've been now successful in the second round, so we have another one. And by conducting phase 1 and often phase 2 assessments on these properties, we learned that we could apply for cleanup funds. So we did that. And these additional resources meant that we could take on even more challenging properties, the worst of the worst, as our code enforcement director used to say. Now, even with that, there were some we couldn't do. I'll be honest. We came up with one where for 50 years there'd been an illegal repair and car shop in someone's home, and they had dumped everything under the house. About $350,000 to do the soil cleanup, and we just couldn't do it. So there's still some we can't. Other people might have better ideas in the future and might be able to do that, but that didn't happen for us. And then COVID hit, right? So the project keeps moving forward, but we became worried that under the economic conditions, a first-time homebuyer's ability to maintain the house would be impacted, right? So we could make the house affordable to acquire, but how did we make it affordable to maintain? We priced out energy-efficient products and tried to mitigate this, but the materials and the appliances and everything that we wanted to use were expensive. And for some properties, we just could not get them to pencil out financially, right? The bond's great. It lets us basically work, but in the end, you know, we still really want to give the bank their money back, right? If nothing else. So then along came the Zero Net Energy Alliance and Energy Solutions and Grid Alternatives, and together we thought, what if we could do this together? How might that work? So we put together a proposal to the California Energy Commission to ensure that every house we restored met the top of Z&E standards. We'd figured out a way, at least one way, to bring housing justice and environmental justice together. Our new homeowners are getting affordable homes. They receive things like smart outlets, smart thermostats, vehicle charging stations, high-efficiency appliances, tankless water heaters, heat pump systems, solar systems, battery storage. The list goes on. And what is even cooler is now MCE's joined our team, and we're working towards community-generated virtual power plants in neighborhoods in Richmond, where residents are generating power and selling it back into the system. So what's next for us? Well, we're working with other cities to replicate this model. We have about $10 million in investors looking for other cities to work with us and to work with those cities to take on these projects. So any cities or counties out there that are willing and interested in this model, we will give you all the templates, all the resources you need at no cost. We just want to help you make this happen. The EPA created a case study and a toolkit for us and has recognized us as one of their promising practices, which is pretty darn cool. And we have that on our table in the hallway. As I mentioned, we have investors working with us to raise, and we've raised an additional $10 million in social impact bond capital to do this in other Bay Area cities. Finally, knowing that we still had wealth gaps in the community, we created a Black Wealth Builders Fund. So we are able to provide down payment assistance of up to $15,000 to Black first-time home buyers in Alameda and Contra Costa County. Finally, we're working on AB 2560. Elisa Bonta, Assemblymember Bonta, is our bill author. We're sponsoring this bill along with some partners to take this model statewide. This is hard work. You all know that. But the results are real. And after all, someone has to do this. So why not all of us here today? Thank you.
So hi everyone, my name is Diana Perez Domensek. I'm a planner in the Strategic Planning Department at the City of Oakland. Thank you. Okay. All right. I work with a great team of planners on the general plan update, and I'm the environmental justice element lead for the city. And I'm very honored and excited to be here with you today to share how Oakland is implementing SB 1000. So, I've got a clicker here. There we go. So the City of Oakland is at the beginning of a 5-year planning process that will take place in 2 phases. And during today's presentation, I will start with an overview of this process and the issues that are going to be addressed, and also talk about how we were approaching community engagement. And my colleague, Maribel, is from Environmental Justice Solutions, is going to dive deeper into the process for identifying environmental justice communities, which is really like the first step in the environmental justice planning process, and give some examples of how the EJ element can build off of existing work like the Equitable Climate Action Plan. So we we start with the general plan update is really an opportunity to advance the city's mission to create a fair and just city through equitable goals, policies, and implementation measures. And this is embedded in our municipal code, which means that the general plan update is using a racial equity lens to identify racial inequity impacts of the proposed policies and programs, which means reducing health disparities in environmental justice communities and really engaging the underrepresented communities and prioritizing the needs of the most impacted communities. And really, we start by acknowledging that racial inequities did not occur by chance, and as we know, that they are the legacy of nearly 180 years of laws and practices that both intentionally and unintentionally harmed indigenous, low-income people of color by creating and recreating the fundamental drivers of inequity. So how are we going to make sure that the general plan update can change outcomes that are impacting communities of color in Oakland? Well, we are very lucky because we get to learn from the work of community leaders who have a long history of organizing for environmental justice, including nationally recognized community leader like Ms. Margaret Gordon, who has introduced our team to the 17 principles of environmental justice and the principles of working together that were adopted at the First People of Color Conference, First People of Color Environmental Justice Summit in 1991. And we have tools in a partnership with the Department of Race and Equity they have created, we have tools that we know from them that we know are critical, like an inclusive public engagement guide, and also a racial equity impact analysis that is a framework that is both data-driven and results-oriented that can help us to evaluate the impacts of policies on equity. And it also really emphasizes engaging impacted communities in this process. And of course, then we're doing some, we have some initiatives to build our internal capacity to do this work. And we already have environmental justice policies, objectives, and goals that have already been articulated in several city-led and community-led plans. And I'll just highlight a couple of them. So, for example, the Healthy Development Guidelines were created in 2017 by a coalition of residents and community organizers. The guidelines promote goals and policies that strengthen environmental justice, sustainability, and health in Oakland. And they cover a wide range of topics that overlap with SB 1000, like housing, food access, and economic opportunity. EONI was a community-driven plan for East Oakland that was completed in 2019. It led by frontline communities. It focused on the goals of reducing greenhouse gases, preventing displacement, improving public health, and building economic opportunity. The plan was funded through a transformative climate community grant administered by the California Strategic Growth. And we also have the West Oakland Community Action Plan, WOCAP, that was a joint project of the Air District and West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project that targets air quality improvement in West Oakland. And I should also mention that the same process through AB 617 is going to be taking place in East Oakland. Earlier this year, the California Air Resources Board approved the designation of East Oakland as a priority, as a AB 617 priority community, meaning that East Oakland will be one of the 3 communities in the Bay Area that works with the Air District to develop a community emissions reduction program to improve air quality. And this designation was driven by community leadership in East Oakland. So we have, we have a lot of great work on that has already happened and is underway that we can build from. So we're not starting from scratch. And of course, we also have the 2030 Equitable Climate Action Plan that was just adopted a couple of years ago. And Maribel is going to talk more about that. So I think many of you already know, but what is a general plan? It's a guiding document for the city. It provides a consistent direction for future development, and is really an opportunity to engage our community in the planning, the decision-making process. And I'll just highlight that many of the elements in Oakland's current general plan were updated over 20 years ago. So as I said, in the first phase of the general plan, we are required by state law to adopt the housing, safety, and EJ element. And we will also be doing an industrial lands policy. In the second phase, we'll be covering the open space conservation recreation element, noise element, and the land use and transportation element. And even though this update is happening in 2 phases, the work that happens in phase 1 will inform phase 2. I'm just going to skip through this part. We've spoken about Senate Bill 1000. I think what I'll highlight here is that Oakland is opting to kind of take both options. We're doing both an environmental justice element and also integrating EJ into the policies and goals of other elements. So the first what I'll highlight here is that the first step in the process of an EJ planning process is really to identify environmental justice communities. And Maribel is going to tell you more about how we're doing this in Oakland. But once environmental justice communities are identified, then the EJ element or EJ policies must work toward reducing the unique or compounded health risks in these communities by decreasing pollution exposure, increasing assets and benefits to the community that improve overall health. The policies must also reduce barriers to inclusive engagement and prioritize the needs and prioritize improvements that benefit and meet the needs of EJ communities. So in the fall of 2020, we conducted a series, the Planning and Building Department conducted a series of listening sessions that were facilitated by PlaceWorks with 41 community organizations, council members, and other agencies and city departments to identify important topics that would be addressed in the general plan process. And some of the environmental issues that we heard from that would be important include really improving public health by focusing on reducing health inequities that are associated with the concentration of residential areas next to freeways, industrial areas, and the seaport. And using policies like buffers, overlay zones, and performance standards to reduce the pollution impacts of industrial activities. And really to take a look at areas that have more incompatible uses due to the inequitable granting of variances and conditional use permits. And so I'll just kind of talk about our community engagement effort is really a key feature of the general plan update. We are engaging stakeholders throughout the city with additional resources dedicated to engaging communities that have been historically underrepresented from traditional planning processes. So we can do this extensive outreach because the general plan update team includes a community consultant who is made up of the deeply rooted collaborative in partnership with 13 local community-based organizations. And they are conducting outreach, meeting people where they are, particularly focusing on the most impacted communities, including communities of color, the unhoused, formerly incarcerated, youth, and really communities who are experiencing environmental injustice. So they will be conducting about 100 engagement activities in the next 4 years, ranging from large cultural events with music and performance to pop-ups at parks, to make sure that Oaklanders have the opportunity to share their solutions, issues, and a vision for Oakland's future. And I will, for the sake of timing, skip this slide and pass it on to my colleague.
Thank you, Deanna. Good morning, everyone. As Deanna mentioned, my name is Maribel Nzegu. I'm the founder and principal of Environmental Justice Solutions, and I'm happy to be working with the City of Oakland on the general plan update. I was also the equity facilitator for the City of Oakland's 2030 Equitable Climate Action Plan. Along with 2 others, we led community engagement for that process, as well as developed a list of community priorities for the ECAP. And then we also drafted a racial equity impact assessment and implementation guide for the ECAP to guide implementation. And so these are some of the principles that we're carrying forward into the general plan process. So, yeah, I can't see, thank you. So, as Deanna mentioned, the City of Oakland is currently in a process of identifying the environmental justice communities within the city limits. And this is a process that is mandated by state law. As you see on the screen, state law, it defines environmental justice communities based on 2 overarching characteristics: the amount of pollution that they experience and the socioeconomic burdens that exacerbate the impacts of those pollutions. And so the state of California has developed a tool which is called the CalEnviro Screen. It's currently in its 4th iteration, and it measures 21 indicators of both pollution and socioeconomic burden to identify the areas of the state with the highest cumulative impacts. However, the state of California is not mandating that everyone use this tool in acknowledgement that one size does not fit all. And in fact, within the tool, there are various different ways that you can use it to highlight different issues that communities are facing. And so the state is allowing flexibility in defining environmental justice communities. The most important characteristic is that you identify the most burdened, the most vulnerable communities within your jurisdiction. And so the way that the City of Oakland is going about this process is to develop its own screen. We will be taking indicators from CalEnviro Screen, both from the pollution burden and socioeconomic burden indicators. We will also be looking at the areas of the city that are designated as low-income areas by AB 1550. And it's important to note that within the low-income areas, as you'll see later, we want to drill down even further to make sure that we are highlighting where the very low income and extremely low income populations are concentrated. Something that's not mandated by state law. SB 1000 has the following topic areas in it, and so we have selected indicators that speak to all of these categories. And we have also added several that are Oakland specific. The CalEnviro Screen does not include race as an indicator, and so that is one of that we have brought to the forefront and even added an additional sort of weighting to that indicator. We also looked at the areas that were previously redlined, and we're incorporating other tools that the City of Oakland has already created, such as the Equity Toolbox. So I see that my time is elapsing here, so I'll try to go a little bit quicker. As I mentioned, the reason for doing an individualized screen for the city is because the tools that we have are measuring the census tracts in the state of California, and they're ranking them against each other, so across the entire state. But for the City of Oakland, it's important to focus on what Oaklanders are experiencing and how the census tracts and neighborhoods within Oakland rank against each other. And that will provide an important avenue for community feedback, because in reality, the community members are the experts about where they live. And a lot of these data sets are gathering data at units that are very large, quite large. The most consistent unit for measuring and for comparison is the census tract. But as we know, air quality data at the census tract level can actually mask some disparities that are going on at a finer grain, from block to block. This house is near this thoroughfare. This house about a block away doesn't have quite the same air quality impacts. And so we're calling on the city to gather and incorporate more data that is hyper-local and find ways to really illustrate the things that are going on in people's neighborhoods. So this next slide lists out a few of the issues that we explored. There's many. We had 50 indicators. So unfortunately, I don't have time to go through them all with you. But if we can go to the next slide. This should show you the map of the draft environmental justice communities that we have located using our screen. As you can see, East and West Oakland are highlighted as some of the most burdened areas. And if you go to the next slide, oh. Okay, yes. So this is looking at the low income limits. And under state law, there are two ways that you can measure it. One is by looking at the HCD statewide income levels. And so those are the ones that are designated at very low, extremely low, and low income. And so you'll see that at the low income limit for the city of Oakland for Alameda County is $98,500. And so this is a very high threshold that we know is going to be leaving out many communities who, for them, that's a high income. And when you look at the statewide median, measuring it according to that, you get a little bit lower. However, the data shows us that, for instance, in the city of Oakland, the African American population, the median household income is around $28,000 to $30,000. So that's the importance of drilling down deeper to really see the impacts. And part of this, the way this plays out, is that Oakland has lost about 33% of its African American population over the last decade. And this result doesn't hold true across all racial groups. For instance, low-income whites have not experienced the same type of displacement from Oakland. So these are the types of issues that we are hoping to uncover as we drill down to the finer scales. And as you can see, the areas where the incomes are the lowest are predominantly Hispanic and Black. So this general plan update, as I mentioned, is really building from the extensive community engagement process that we did to support the 2030 Oakland ECAP. And really, we were able to reach about 5,000 Oaklanders through various means. Standing in the back is David Ralston, who helped out with that process as part of Oakland Climate Action Coalition. And some of the key strategies in the ECAP speak to the general plan directly. For instance, transportation and land use strategy number 1 from the ECAP says that the general plan and, in fact, all other plans that Oakland does subsequently are required to be in alignment with the ECAP's equity goals. So there's a lot of text on that slide, but it's really about making sure that we gather the right type of data to identify frontline communities. Where there are gaps in the data, we make a plan to collect that data or gather it. And we also find it important to actively monitor the process, how the money is being spent, and what the outcomes are that we're achieving, so that we can course correct in real time as necessary to make sure that the funds are actually going to the people that need it the most. And so a couple of the strategies that are in the ECAP revising zoning so that a majority of Oakland residents are within a half-mile of their most essential destinations of everyday life, and removing barriers to incentivize development of housing, especially housing for very low income residents, near transit-oriented development, which is a key strategy for reducing vehicle miles traveled, but also for preventing displacement. So I think that is my time. Thank you very much. Should I help you?
I think I'm okay. So I'm Sophie McGuinness, and I'm a planner at Alameda County Planning Department. And thank you to all the great grounding that Maribel and Deanna provided about SB 1000 and general plans and community engagement. I'm going to focus on a different aspect of SB 1000 and to share our experience at Alameda County as we're starting to develop an environmental justice element, looking in particular at our stakeholder engagement process of partnering with partner organisations. So at Alameda County, we have an existing health and wellness element in our general plan, and we're going to be updating that to become an SB 1000 compliant environmental justice element. We're in the process of developing our community engagement process and completing the data screening that City of Oakland described. And as I said, for the focus today, I'd just like to share with you some of our plans and experience preparing for stakeholder engagement. So we're working with counties, agencies and departments, and a range of CBOs and service providers via the Ashland Cherryland Healthy Communities Collaborative. We're leveraging this existing network to engage the broad range of stakeholders with an interest or responsibility for topics under SB 1000. So we're in Alameda County today. This is a map I thought I'd share just for interest about what the unincorporated areas include. So the cities are grayed out, including City of Berkeley, where we're sitting today. But you'll see the parts of the aerial map that you can see, with including the water bodies and the contours of the land, that's all of the unincorporated areas. So it's actually over 50% of the total land area of the county. It goes as far east out as Altamont Pass, where you might recognise the wind farms as you go over the pass there. And out in rural East County, there's a lot of agricultural uses, vineyards and other activities out there. But for the purpose of our environmental justice element, we're going to be focusing on the urban unincorporated county. So I've included a little pop-out image there. These are the communities of Ashland, Cherryland, Hayward Acres, San Lorenzo, and Castro Valley. They're located between the city of San Leandro and the city of Hayward. And as you'll see on that pop-out, they're intersected by a range of freeways that crisscross the area. So there's the 580, the 880, and the 238. And as Mitchell described in his opening, this would count as the flatlands. So the history of urban unincorporated county, it has an agricultural history, and then more recently it's transitioned to residential with some commercial corridors as well and some light industrial uses. As we've started work on our screening for SB 1000, there's that, as Tiana and Maribel touched on, there's the Cal Enviro Screen tool, and cities and counties are required to do an environmental justice element and or incorporate environmental justice throughout their general plan if they've got census tracts in the top 25% of Cal Enviro Screen. In unincorporated Alameda County, we don't have any census tracts in the top 25%. But SB 1000, the framework, requires you to then do if you don't have top 25% disadvantaged communities, to do an extra level of analysis, which is to look at any low-income census tracts and then look at all the different environmental data sets that you can identify to consider, are there low-income communities that, notwithstanding they're not in the top 25%, still do experience a disproportionately high environmental burden. So undertaking that exercise, we're still in the process of completing the data screening, but we identified that there's 15 census tracts in these communities that are low income. And based off previous project experience and community feedback in various forums, we're aware that there's high health impacts and environmental burdens in these communities. The communities are also predominantly non-white. Latinx is the largest population group, with up to 58% Latinx population in one of the communities, Cherryland, and 64% in the really small census tract community of Hayward Acres. So as I mentioned, an interesting feature of our update is that we actually have an existing community health and wellness element. So this is an optional element in a general plan. It was adopted in 2015 and came out of community interest and concern about the kinds of issues that are now covered and mandated by the state to be considered under SB 1000. Our health and wellness element was prepared in partnership between the Community Development Agency and our Public Health Department, and it involves substantial community outreach and engagement. The data that was considered back in the development of the health and wellness element confirmed that these areas do experience disproportionately high levels of socioeconomic disadvantage and environmental burden. And some of the key factors in our area include substantially high rates of poverty and income deficiency, unemployment, and severe housing cost burden. We have really high rates of emergency department visits for asthma and cardiovascular disease. And as an example of some of the environmental factors we're considering, some of the worst concentrations of diesel PM air pollution in the state occur in these unincorporated areas, with up to 97th percentile in CalEnviro for one of the communities, Ashland. These communities were also very hard hit by COVID. Our public health department, many of them have been redeployed to work on COVID in the past several years, so they're our partner on this project, but we're only just starting to get to re-engage with them fully as some of the COVID demands are relaxing a little. Death rates in these areas ranged from 15% higher than the average county death rate in Castro Valley low-income census tracts to up to 61% higher than the average county rate in the Ashland low-income census tract. So it was a really, really hard-hit community. All of the topics that are called out in SB 1000 were addressed in the health and wellness element to some extent in 2015. So we have a pretty good sense of what the community issues and priorities were then, around 7 years ago, and we're going to build off that as a bit of a foundation and starting point for our work. This slide just shows what we're calling the 6 pillars of environmental justice that are really called out in SB 1000. As we've sort of been assessing these and trying to think, SB 1000 gives us flexibility to include additional topics based off community interest and concern and feedback. And also we have flexibility to make sure we cover all of these topics, but in any combination or way that makes sense for our community. And as we've been starting our assessment around these topic areas, recognising the role that SB 1000 plays to acknowledge the power that land use planning has to influence health and equity outcomes. Although the EJ element sits within the general plan, and that's our purview in the planning department, we also realise that these policies and programs in each of these 6 areas are going to involve other partner organisations. This is a slide of some of our early work looking at the SB 1000 topic areas and starting to think about what are the kind of needs and assets that come up in each of these topic areas. The 6th one, civic engagement, is bolded and down the bottom right there. It doesn't have its own sub-list, but it's a really important aspect of SB 1000 that we think is going to be of real interest to our community members. The civic engagement topic talks about community engagement and outreach for SB 1000 and the development of the EJ element itself, but also looks at ways to embed civic engagement opportunities to improve communities' outcomes beyond the life of the EJ element. So we're really excited to see what comes out of our community process for opportunity areas in that regard as well. But looking at this breadth of issues, as I mentioned, we're definitely going to have to work with partner organisations that have expertise beyond just the planning department. And we're aiming to meet these stakeholders where they are, which in this case was to approach the Ashland Cherryland Healthy Communities Collaborative. So I'll shorthand call it the collaborative because it's a long name. But the mission of the collaborative is to achieve a healthy, just and economically viable community. The collaborative coordinates 25 plus non-profits and county agencies and departments that are supporting and providing services and programs in Ashland and Cherryland. The collaborative identifies community needs, gaps in programs and services, and works to address issues, secure new resources for the area, and or to launch new initiatives to support the community. So in 2022, the collaborative has been in existence for, I think, around over 15 years, And it's changed and had a few iterations based off community need and capacity during that time. So this year in 2022, the collaborative is separated basically into two buckets. And the first bucket is the basic needs bucket. So this group emerged within the collaborative during COVID. There was a huge, as I mentioned, huge impact of COVID on these unincorporated urban communities. And so the basic needs bucket is those representatives on the collaborative that are responsible for short-term, immediate community needs. So those members of the collaborative that deal with issues like food distribution, things like access to diapers, COVID testing and vaccinations, real basic needs and immediate concerns. That group's meeting every 2 weeks still, because the need still exists to address those kinds of issues for the unincorporated urban areas. The other bucket or half of the collaborative are groups like us in the planning department that are more concerned with long-range strategy, infrastructure type issues. So we were able to approach the conveners of the collaborative, and luckily they agreed to call this second half of the collaborative for 2022. We're working as the environmental justice bucket, and we're all convening, meeting monthly to work on the development of SB 1000. This is just a slide of some of the participants in the collaborative. You'll see there's a pretty good mix of county agencies and departments, but also service providers and CBOs. And in unincorporated areas that lack some of that cohesion or certain forums that a city might have, this has proved to be such an important meeting place for us to share ideas and work together across county and CBOs and other organisations. I'll just touch, this is the role that we see the collaborative having in the environmental justice element. As Deanna and Maribel mentioned, the environmental justice elements really do need to be community driven. But these partner organisations, particularly some of the more grassroots organisations, really are also an important resource for us to understand how to reach community, who our most impacted community members are, and they're going to help us with that ground truthing exercise once we've completed our data sets to really provide context for that data and see how it plays out and help support our understanding of the community feedback that we receive. The collaborative are also going to help us with goal setting and policy crafting, and they're going to share their strategic goals and directions that contribute to environmental justice. So groups like the Parks District and the Food Bank and others are already working on some amazing initiatives, and we want to make sure we capture those under our environmental justice element. The collaborative is also going to help us with development of the community engagement strategy. So we in the planning department have some experience trying to reach particularly impacted communities that are called out under SB 1000, but the groups of the collaborative have a real depth of knowledge and understanding of these communities that we hope to work from and make sure we're not reinventing the wheel but using some of their best practices for our community engagement. And importantly, we see the role of the collaborative as being really instrumental for implementation. So we're working this year on the environmental justice element with a view to having it adopted early next year, and we're planning on starting implementation straight away. So after the life of the EJ element process being led by the planning department, it's these people at the collaborative who, all the various departments and agencies and different CBOs and service providers who have a role to play, that collaborative will continue on for hopefully another 15 years or more, and they'll be able there to keep us honest and make sure that the plan gets implemented and followed through for the benefit of the community. So just in conclusion, we're really excited at the planning department to be starting the process of developing the EJ element, and we've been working hard to get a robust process in place for engaging with these partner organisations. Working out the best way to do this has been a learning process, and we didn't just start on this now, to Deanna's point. We've been engaging with the collaborative over the last several years and building on relationships and participation, including from that early work on the health and wellness element in 2015. So if you're in a smaller community like ours and you're starting work on an EJ element now and have an opportunity to leverage off an existing network like this, it's a model that we've found to be highly effective so far. And if you don't already have these kind of partnerships in place, then perhaps your work on an EJ element might be the first building block towards creating something like this for your community. That's all I was covering today.
Good morning. It's really nice to join you here today. My name is Jody London. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for Contra Costa County. I happen to be a resident of Oakland, and I happen to have been a member of the advisory committee for the Equitable Climate Action Plan. But I'm going to talk to you today about Envision Contra Costa 2040, which for us is an update of our general plan, our climate action plan, and our zoning code all at the same time. The last time our general plan was updated was 30 years ago. It is literally a word process document. It's not even in PDF form, so it was really long overdue. But there's a lot of interplay between the climate action plan and the general plan. The general plan is a longer document. It sets out these long, time horizons, 2040, Envision 2040, looking at how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the climate action plan becomes the implementation document for that. In our general plan, we are weaving throughout it sustainability, environmental justice, community wellness, and economic development. So we're not going to have a specific environmental justice element, but it's going to be everywhere. And the draft goals and policies and actions are actually posted on our website. And when you go there, we've started to go to our planning commission, you can see them tagged, and there's multiple icons for each one. And in fact, on Monday evening, our sustainability commission will be looking at the sustainability aspects in the general plan. And that agenda is also posted online, and I'm happy to give you more information about how you can join us 5 o'clock on Monday. So I'm going to gloss over the SB 1000 slides because we've heard a lot about that already, and I think you all have a pretty good idea at this point of what SB 1000 does. And I'm going to talk about Contra Costa County and get very specific. So Contra Costa County is a community that has many census tracts identified under the CalEnviro screen exercise. And we call them impacted communities because people don't really like to be told their community is disadvantaged. But they are impacted, definitely, and you can see them in the kind of orange color up there. And if I had a map up here of refineries, you would see that many of these communities are in the shadow of a refinery. We have 4 oil refineries in Contra Costa County. 2 of them actually have applications pending right now to process renewable fuel. So that's another thing to be watching in our community. So we've been really focused on these communities. We have 18 unincorporated communities in our county, and some of them are Blackhawk and Diablo, and you can see them, Alamo. Some of them are wealthier, and then some of them are not, and some of them are disadvantaged. So there's some overlap there. For each of our unincorporated communities, we have developed community profiles, and that's where we're going very deep. We've been doing meetings very specifically with the unincorporated communities to say, what are the issues in your community? What should we address? Is there zoning you'd like to change? Are there other things? And so that's where we are seeing the diversity of the different communities, that comprise Contra Costa. So within the general plan, we have many policy topics, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but we're considering all of these things as we look at this. So this is the first half of them. This is the second group, and what we have heard consistently as we've been out talking with our communities about the general plan and the climate action plan is that people really want access to locally grown fresh food. They really want to be able to safely bike and walk and take transit, and they really want to have economic opportunity. And those are themes that have come through in the work I've been doing specific to the Climate Action Plan and in our general plan work. So I'm going to talk now about the outreach that we've been doing. We started this process in 2019, and we were going along, and then COVID, so things kind of slowed down. So we're on a slower track than we had initially thought, but I think there are some good things that have come out of that because the pivot to online meetings really, once we got the hang of it, enhanced our ability to reach people. But we've had 19 you can see all the meetings we've had. Meetings in impacted communities. We've had county-wide collaborations on environmental justice, sustainability, and health. We did workshops around the climate action plan. We did these open house events, and all of these materials are posted on our website if you want to go back and see them. And we're actually gearing up because we're going to be releasing the general plan and the climate action plan for environmental review later this year. We're gearing up to do all of this again. So it's pretty exciting. We did very specific outreach around the environmental justice policy in the fall of, in 2020 and 2021. We used a survey tool online. We went all over the place distributing this survey. We were at the food bank, dropping the survey into as people were picking up their food. One of the things that was most effective for us was a paid ad on Facebook. $5,000, and we got probably close to 100,000 views. It was a really successful tool, just a little tip there. And the other thing that was really helpful for us was once we realized that we don't need to create our own meetings. Let's go to the found meetings. There's lots of folks having meetings all the time. So we started going to their meetings and asking for 5 or 10 minutes on their agenda, and that would pique their interest. And sometimes we'd get invited back for more. Sometimes that was all they needed, but they could go take the survey, whatever it was. So we're going to do all of that again. We also have in Contra Costa County a sustainability commission that I staff through my group, and it's a 17-member commission, and we worked a lot with the sustainability commission to develop the environmental justice policies. That group reports up to a sustainability committee of our board of supervisors, so it's been a very effective way to get they represent the entire county, so that's been very helpful. In February of 2021, we did some very focused meetings around environmental justice. And as you can see, we had 3 different topics. It's such a huge area that we couldn't do it all in one. And we're finding that with everything that we're doing with the general plan and particularly with environmental justice, that we need to give people multiple opportunities to engage with the information and the material. So what's coming up next for us, as I mentioned, we're deep in reviewing these draft goals, plans, and actions. We call them the GOPAs. Our Planning Commission has been reviewing these different elements of the general plan serially, and their next meeting will be this Wednesday. Well, Wednesday of next week. We're on Friday today. We're also meeting with our Hazardous Materials Commission. We're all over the place. We're going to have our draft plan in 2022, and then we'll be adopting it next year. Keep in touch with us. We'd love to talk with you about the work we're doing and learn from what you're doing. Sign up on our email list if you want to get more information on all of this. My colleague, Will Nelson, is the lead on the general plan. I'm the lead on the CAP. We work very closely together and sit right next to each other when we're in the office. So easy to find us, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for that wonderful group of panelists, both professionals and many activists in your community. I know Jody is one, reaching throughout the East Bay. I'd like to invite Joanna back up to facilitate discussion, and I will choose people. If you want to raise your hand, if I need to, I'll repeat it. The question, and we have about 10 minutes. We're running just a little behind, but we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And then I encourage all those in the audience, the next session is interactive. You will be meeting different groups, and I'll mention them after the Q&A here. But we encourage you to come up to the panelists, introduce yourself, meet the table hosts, who I'll introduce just after this, and really use that as a networking session. It'll be our elongated intermission too. Thank you. And Joanna, please come up. Anybody have questions at this time?
Thank you, Margo.
Go ahead, Nova.
Yeah, I'll just repeat the question so that everybody can hear. So I think what I heard is an interest in hearing more about inclusive community engagement and getting some concrete recommendations from our panelists. Mm-hmm. So Jody, I know you talked about that. Deanna, you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think what we are finding in Oakland is that it's really critical to have community partners that are trusted by communities that are not represented, that typically are underrepresented in planning processes. And so not only because they have the relationships and the trust, but also because they're able to translate translate the information in a way and present the information in a way that's accessible, and ask the right questions. I think another thing that is very critical is, in Oakland we have 3 teams on the general plan update. We have staff, city staff, and management and leadership, and we have our technical team of consultants, and Maribel and EJ Solutions is one of them, and we have our community consultant. So all of the 3 of us, it's very critical to be able to line up the community engagement in such a way that the feedback that we receive informs those critical milestones in the process. So those are 2 things that I can share. I think another thing that we've learned from the Department of Race and Equity is to really evaluate the process. So being able to track, being able to kind of take a moment to look at who we are engaging, and course correct if needed. So taking a look at demographics of who's showing up at our meetings.
Yep. Anybody want to add? Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, thanks. I'll add one thing to that. I didn't talk about the community engagement in our piece because I knew my co-panelists would. But one thing I would also recommend that I think is a good emerging practice is please compensate people for their time, right? The community shows up and they're not paid like we are. So please, whether it's a $25 or $50 gift card or whatever, please compensate them because we're all getting paid too.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Thank you.
Hear a lot of agreement from the audience.
I can add just some comments. I know, again, we didn't touch on that on our community engagement piece, and it's still in development for our project, but obviously it's super specific to the community in your location, and for us in unincorporated Alameda County, some of the things we're considering are around language access and cultural competency, given, as I mentioned, the high Latinx population that we have. We're working, one of our partners for outreach is Tiburcio Vasquez Health Center, and they have an existing promotores program that does community outreach. We in the Community Development Agency, where the planning department sits, we've been trying to work off some of recent experience we've had around outreach to these particularly impacted communities, and that included around Census 2020. And I think out of that process, we definitely resonate what Deanna said around trusted messengers and the importance of leveraging community members that are already trusted, not just having department staff, and allowing people 3 minutes at the mic. We also did a recent pilot around impacts of increased heat as a result of climate change and opportunities in our location to help introduce some interventions to protect from that. And given, as City of Oakland, and I think Jody touched on, a lot of the disproportionately impacted communities for environmental justice are the same communities that are really impacted by climate change impacts. So we definitely got some experience we can leverage off there for developing our approach.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Thank you so much. So I just to reiterate, I think what we're hearing the importance of trust, and I want to just amplify that by saying I think part of accessing and maintaining access to trusted messengers in the community is also honoring and continuing to build on that trust by doing exactly what Deanna said and incorporating the feedback into our process and sharing with the community how we used what they did so that they continue to be able to trust us and they continue to be motivated to be engaged because they see that their involvement makes a difference. Thank you for that. Let's go to the next question. I heard there was a hand. Let's see. Okay, right here. Mm-hmm. All right, so I think I heard 2 questions there. One is how to keep people engaged in these very complex topics over processes that might last multiple years. And then also when we achieve the end of that process and move into the implementation stage, what role do brownfields and brownfield redevelopment play in implementing and achieving some of the important environmental justice and climate goals that you've talked about?
Okay, I'll take a crack at that.
Good job.
It's a very big question.
Big question.
and these processes are really long, but although, I mean, I will say that the people who live near these facilities, they've been there longer, right? The number of people I interact with at meetings who say, I'm 85 years old and I've lived here for 60 years or whatever, they've been bearing the burden for a long time, and they're going to stick with it to see the outcome that they want to see. The brownfields issue is tricky because there are the cleanup issues that Jim described so eloquently. And there's also the fact that those brownfields are zoned for industry. And that means they're zoned for revenue, for potential revenue. And so you really start to have to balance these competing concerns, right? And part of me wants, I do want to redevelop the brownfields in Contra Costa County, but I'm not sure I want them to be housing unless they're already zoned for housing. It might be more beneficial for me to continue to use them for jobs purposes, right? In Contra Costa County, we have a big jobs housing imbalance. The people in San Francisco who do the regional planning seem to think that everybody wants to commute to San Francisco to work. We have a lot of housing, or Oakland, and actually I do the reverse commute, but we have a lot of housing in the eastern part of Contra Costa County, and we want to see more jobs out there. We also know that we have rising waters out there. We know that there are facilities with hazardous materials that are potentially impacted. So there's a lot of planning that needs to go into this, and we actually are about to receive a federal community planning funding grant. It's basically what they used to call an earmark. We're receiving a $750,000 grant from the federal government to do some planning work around economic transition, and our voters also approved a sales tax in 2020, and some of that revenue is coming to our planning department to do some planning work. But it's very, very high level, politically sensitive, because there's so many competing concerns. I don't know if I answered your question, but sorry, that was kind of long.
Yes, please, Deanna.
That was, I'm so happy you answered that question. I want to just channel, to kind of get back on the topic of community engagement, want to channel Oakland's Planning and Building Director, Bill Gilchrist, who often reminds us that if we do good community engagement and when community feels ownership of the plan, they will drive implementation, right? So when the community can feel ownership of the plan, then it's more likely to be implemented, and there's that energy behind implementation of the plan.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Please go ahead, Maribel.
For the 2030 ECAP, we recommended that the City of Oakland deliberately enter into partnerships with community-based organizations to make sure that there is longstanding engagement. And we also called for them to convene an oversight body. So not just engaging the community, but giving them power over implementation, as was mentioned. And so those are two of the key critical strategies for continuing meaningful engagement long term.
That's great. Thank you for those specifics. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, go ahead. All right, so a question about, again, touching on this issue of trust, which especially when we look at the history of these communities and the development patterns that have been in place and allowed to persist for generations, we can understand why community members might be approaching these planning processes with a lack of trust and their politicians with a lack of trust. So I know you guys have dealt with this every day, so what are some of your responses?
Yeah, I'll jump into that. So one of the things at the foundation that we do a lot of is reflecting on our values, right? So when I speak at a like with my staff or anything, we always start with, these are my values. So I'm Jim Becker. My values are love, compassion, and justice for myself and all others. And when I stand in that, when I work with communities, I bring that. I have to bring that, right? Or people will call me on it. on my staff team, and that's okay. But I do think that not only that, but if you're going to work with communities, you have to embrace them as well, right? You can't just be there to do a job. I think one of the reasons that we've been as successful as we have in Contra Costa County is because we show up, right? It might not be convenient, but if there's a neighborhood block party at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night and we're invited, we're going to show up. And it doesn't mean we're working. We're building a relationship. And the folks here on this panel, I can't speak for all of them, but I know that we're all trying to bring that sense of love and embracing and real relationship and connection, authentic connection to the work.
Beautiful. Thank you. Do you guys want to add anything?
Yeah, I had something to add just on behalf of the unincorporated areas of Alameda County. I would say that I think there is a real professional shift within the planning field where the expectation around equitable engagement and, doing more than lip service on community engagement is really becoming institutionalized and mainstreamed. So hopefully you'll see more planners like us who are implementing that. I think you will. In our planning department, we're a smaller community, so I think people really do have pretty direct access to us. They see our names and faces, and as Jim said, if someone invites us to events, we're there. That doesn't replace, the role of partnering with CBOs and making sure those trusted messengers aren't just departmental staff, but I think we certainly take our responsibilities in that regard to engage really genuinely seriously. The collaborative model that I described, I just wanted to share, if planning is politics, I can say that the supervisorial districts that represent those unincorporated areas, District 3 and District 4 supervisors' offices in Alameda County, it's really them that drive and establish and maintain that foundation of the collaborative. And I think they were the real drivers around recognising that need for county departments and agencies to also work with the CBOs and service providers. So we do see the supervisors' district offices have been huge partners for us and continue to be. Just wanted to share that.
All right. Okay. With that, I think that we've reached our time for this panel, so I hope you will all join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for this morning. Thank you, Margo.
So at this time, we're going to proceed into our next session. It's sort of an interactive session, so we invite you all to come out. I'll name all the participating host groups and exhibitors. And for those on live stream, we will return again about 11:10 to our third panel, and don't miss it, on funding and resources and the capital stack, what it takes to develop. So please go out and visit. We have very diverse groups. We have Asian Pacific Environmental Network. In particular, they'll talk about some of their engagement techniques. They're very intergenerational and working with other cultural communities. West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, which has a unique propensity to engage with public agencies, collaborations with the city, with the Air District, with the port, and with the community. And then on it was good to bring up the economic note. We have East Bay Economic Development Alliance, which is the two-county official quasi-governmental body, and they've just produced East Bay Forward in November. So that will give you an idea how they're looking at these issues of balance of job creation, supporting industry and economic growth for the county, throughout the county, and also taking into account equity, environment, and the issues we're talking about today. And then we have PlaceWorks, which was essential in developing SB 1000. They can talk about some of those technical tools. And we also have 2 job training centers, both of whom are EPA grantees. Cypress Mandela Training Center in East Oakland, which has expanded beyond just sort of brownfield remediation, industrial hygiene, and does green construction, and also future build of East County. And again, representing that area, which was just mentioned by Jody, has a lot of big industrial engines, but also needs to diversify and grow its economic base. So future build is also an EPA grantee doing job training, in environmental remediation and green construction. So I welcome you. We'll return back here about 11:10 10 or so for the last panel. There will be coffee, pastries, tea throughout, network, talk to all the panelists, talk to our table hosts and exhibitors. Thank you. Hello, hello to the live stream audience. We are welcoming you all back, and the attendees are coming in. And we will begin our panel 3 on funding and resources very shortly. All right. Thank you, everyone who's been attending so far. I'm just going to make a couple of announcements now before we begin our last panel. The East Bay Environmental Justice Forum is part of a little bigger initiative. We have 2 other events or products that we are producing as part of this initiative. One is what we call a movie nar. A movie nar is sort of a film interview we'll have up shortly on our website live within the next week or so. And this is a very interesting perspective on economic development and environmental justice. Based on the questions from panel 1, we got into a little bit of the topic, and Contra Costa County pointed out the need to continue to grow jobs in balance with the environment and the needs of residents who don't want to commute long distances. So we have John McManus, who is a vice chairman of Cushman Wakefield in Oakland, who is, we have on film being interviewed about the large brownfield sites, large industrial sites, what is their evolution, and what he sees as emerging trends. It folds in well with the East Bay Economic Development Agent Alliance's East Bay Forward report on new industries and how these parcels may transition to both economic equity and environmental purposes over the course of time. The second event will be on May 11th. It's going to be on creativity and culture in equitable brownfield development. So this will be a national webinar completely just online, and it will feature a lot of East Bay people speaking of how you integrate culture and creativity in this time of the pandemic economy where known uses such as standard office and big box retail or even small scale retail are lessening, and looking at other non-residential uses on brownfield combo sites with residential. Thank you very much for our panel. I'm just going to introduce our moderator. Nova has been introduced before. She is our Region 9 Regional Brownfields manager for the US EPA in the Bay Area. And Nova is going to moderate this panel about funding and resources. And we have panelists from CCLR, which is Ignacio Dairit and Natalie Nava, who will speak to the Department of Toxic Controls, Substance Control grant and funding programs, as well as a general overview, and Heather Hood from Enterprise Community Partners, who will give us a bigger picture of the capital stack and how funding, different funding sources layers in the complexity of developing brownfields. Thank you, Nova, if you want to come and give some opening.
Thank you, Margo. And I'm really happy to be here this morning. I'll keep it short so we have lots of time for our presenters to talk. So really we're going to go over how you take a brownfield from the pre-development stage all the way through redevelopment. So we'll be talking about the state resources, EPA resources, lots of technical assistance, and then Heather's going to help us understand how you go from once you have a clean piece of property, how do you start building up. So thank you very much. We'll start with Ignacio.
Thank you. Yes, you can hear me. Well, good morning, and thank you for the audience also, and thank you for the panelists earlier this morning. It was a very good. No, that's where you want to go, and the brownfields is one of the way we want to get to sustainable and equitable development. And so, just a bit about CCLR. Again, thank you for the kind words from Trina. We've been doing this for 23 years. We provide technical assistance, essentially trying to get grants to communities. And understanding, we heard earlier today that the communities you work with, cities, nonprofits, and communities and grassroots, this has to be an ongoing conversation. It goes on for a long time, and sustaining that is very difficult. So what Jim said, find a way to compensate communities and keep them going is probably a good way to keep that discussion going. Not that we keep paying them, but then we need to sustain them and get their contingent involvement because things develop over time, and these are very complex issues. So just a word about brownfields. People misunderstand what a brownfield is. A brownfield is a site that has perceived issues. That means that practically any building that has an industrial or even commercial use from the past may have perceived issues. This beautiful building we're in, cool, isn't it? I think this used to be some kind of barn or warehouse. Well, 20, 30 years ago, or maybe, no, I think they developed like 15 years ago, maybe a little longer. This had environmental issues. It probably had lead and asbestos. And this building would have qualified for an EPA brownfields grant to do site assessments and maybe for planning. It probably didn't show up on a DTSC or EPA website, but that's what we're talking about brownfields. It's a site that has some history that, all along, when you look at Shattuck Avenue, many sites there as well, they're being redeveloped. There was a Staples that was there. It used to be a warehouse, and the warehouse is now gone. It's now going to become affordable housing. All these sites would have been eligible for a brownfield grant and maybe a DTSC grant. So when you see a building and it looks like it's underutilized, it could be something else. There are perceived issues there, but also there's a transaction needed. You have to buy it, and you have to build on it. And whenever you dig into the ground, you'll have to do a phase 1 and a phase 2. Well, guess what? If everything else lines up, that would be eligible for some kind of brownfield technical assistance directly from the EPA, or maybe from a grant where you actually apply for a grant and receive it. So here are some misconceptions about a brownfield. It's a Superfund site. No, not actually. A brownfield is a Superfund site. Can't be a brownfield site, even though it has similar issues, but that's more of a legal issue. But there are many misconceptions of a brownfield. The basic is that if you want to reuse it and there's a potential liability of purchasing it and owning it and building on it, then you can potentially use brownfields funds for it. That's the lesson here. And if you leave here with any other lesson on this, from me anyway, let that stick, because you can go to DTSC and perhaps the EPA to get assistance for these types of for due diligence. Now, but our goal is sustainable reuse. It could be a project. We talked about climate action plans. Climate action plans tend to propose projects like parks, trails, but also sustainable jobs, cooling centers. There are a variety of types of projects that fall under sustainable reuse. But that's the end goal. There's a long process to get there. You have to identify actually, I can take this out, can I? Okay, identify a site. If you have a site, you assess it. You have to plan. You got to clean it up, and then you got to do remediation. You got to do site prep. Lots of things that actually were even suggested at the earlier session. This is kind of the brick and mortar part of sustainable development. And there's money for that. The brownfield, and besides, I think the slides will be available, so no need to take picture of everything. But there's a pot of money for each step of the way. But you have to go to different pot for different steps. And so the early part, that's where the EPA and the DTSC funds come in. But as you move forward, you have to go to other pots of money. And you have to figure out where you are in this process and strategize. Some of these take years. Some may take a few months. Some of them take years to develop, and you need partnerships to get to this money. So that's another lesson here. It's a long process, and you need partnerships. And again, that's where the community engagement that we discussed earlier today becomes important. It's all part of the picture, and we tend to get involved in different, with the same stakeholders on different issues, as this show grant will show you, this chart will show you. Because each project has to be fit into a general plan. It has to have land, you have to consider land use and zoning, you need entitlements, and then you need money to get projects going, to get your sustainable reuse. And it's even more complicated. Each color there, each chart there, this is my chart. This is not anyone's chart. This is just a make-believe chart, but it's really complicated because each person, each group, has a different role each step of the process. And so it's a long timeline, but that's a big picture. When you're looking at brownfields redevelopment, these are the kinds of things you should think about when you're working with other people, the people you work with, and the money you have to go after. So with that, I'm going to hand this off now to Natalie. Who's going to talk about one of the pots of money we're talking about.
Thank you, Ignacio. My name is Natalie. I'm the new program manager at CCLR. So I've been taking a deep dive. I'm a planner, but was not as familiar with brownfields and hadn't worked at this level. So there's a lot of great opportunity. I myself am from El Monte and the Inland Empire in LA. So for me, it was just such a beautiful experience to provide technical assistance to people across the state, really revitalizing their brownfields. And I really want to highlight some money that's coming through the Department of Toxic Substances Control, Cal EPA. It's a Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities initiative that was passed in 2021. And today we're going to talk about that blue part of that pie, which is the Equitable Communities Revitalization Grant. So $270 million over the next 3 years. And there are other grants, just so people know about this, that they are getting designed, and they are specifically for these historically disadvantaged communities who have been waiting so long, right, for this funding to come. And so there's a lot of opportunity here. So the ECRG grant program just finished up its first round. Like I said, it's about $270 million over the next 3 years. And the different entities are local government agencies, nonprofits, and tribes as well. And you don't have to be a federally recognized tribe. You could be a tribal nonprofit or have some kind of state recognition in order to apply. And so there's really a lot of different opportunities for partnerships because you don't have to have access to the site. You can, of course, if you own the site, great, but you just have to have approval to have access to the site that you'd like to clean up. Yeah, and so like I said, the highest priority, we do look at use Cal Enviro Screen as part of the scoring for the grant because we do want to prioritize, but we also know, as a lot of the speakers said, that there are, like we talked about, census tract levels, how one area of a neighborhood might have a higher need. And so definitely want to offer that, you can explain that in your application and really ground truth that so that you can make a case for the area that you're advocating for. So one of the next things is that it's a reimbursement grant. So you do have to know that, and it's over 2 years. And really, we're really always thinking about the reuse, right? What are these communities' visions and dreams for their neighborhoods? Building on all the hard work that people have talked about here today with climate action plans, resiliency initiatives, public health initiatives that look different depending, from one block to the next. It can look very different. And so one thing I wanted to say is I'm going to go over, there's 3 different grant types, and it just really depends where you're at in your brownfield journey. The first one we'll talk about, which there are some parallels with EPA grants, so Nova will go over those. But the first one is community-wide assessments. So you can define your area however you want, and you need a minimum of 4 sites. So oftentimes, like I've seen Parks District Supply or community-based organizations working with city partners who want to really drill down into the neighborhood level. This is for like preliminary studies, whether it's environmental, land use, and really just to understand the beginning levels of looking into the contamination as well as the history of the site, so that then you can, do deeper community engagement to figure out what are the priorities. And the ECRG currently does fund, some community engagement activities related to this. And so really the end goal is to really create an inventory. And then once you have a site, or if you already have a site that as an applicant you want to focus on, the next grant type is a site-specific investigation. So that's, where you're doing more testing. And I won't get into all the acronyms that I have been learning from the consultants on these calls. But really, it's really to understand on a deeper level what's really needed to remediate. And I wanted to highlight, it is Earth Day today, and this is the place where you would apply if you wanted to do phyto or micro remediation, which we have seen a lot of some projects, tribes, as well as community-based EJ organizations that are interested in doing that, because they're thinking about food resiliency, they're thinking about other things that is important for them to not just haul off the waste, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this. And then finally, of course, getting a cleanup plan approved, and then cleanup, that's the ultimate goal. So those are the three different grants. So like I said, we just finished the first round of the ECRG, and DTSC is currently reviewing applications, but I wanted to kind of just show people how it went. We got 112 million requested. As you can see, about 75 of those are in high CES score areas. 84% were in that 50th percentile. Of course, like I said, if people don't have that 99 CES score and are much lower, they could still be very much impacted and have great projects. And so I just wanted to, highlight that because people do ask about that. And how did California do? So as expected, there's clusters in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, but we know that there are communities all across the state that need the support, and there's really cool partnerships even in like rural areas, people working with tribes, people potentially affected by wildfires. And in the East Bay, we got over 20 applicants. As we have Richmond, East and West Oakland, Hayward, San Leandro, and there's just really amazing projects. Of course, I can't talk about them yet, but everything from 100% affordable housing, TOD projects, cultural and resource centers, Native American support for different communities here, including parks districts that are looking to really clean up these brownfields in these areas. And so it really just depends what the potential is, and all the work that people have been doing to build on this, and this is an opportunity to fund that. And really right now is the time to start planning for the second round. We have a couple months to be doing outreach, and so please reach out to us so that we can get in touch with you. We haven't, started technical assistance for the next round yet because we really want to do evaluation and figure out how can we always continue to make this process more equitable, right, from the start, from the grant design. But DTSC does want to meet with people, and so please reach out to us because we have a couple months to really make sure that the voices are heard that need to be heard, and that you all can get started. I know that depending on the capacity of the applicant, they might need a longer time frame to really get their application ready, to get their partnerships ready, in order to be competitive. And so CCLR is here to support that, and that's our email there. And here's Ignacio in Richmond working on a brownfield project. And lastly, I just wanted to mention, to get through these times, I think creativity is really important, and to really start you all thinking about if you don't have a site, we have a photo contest. And so it's really amateur, professional, it doesn't matter. Work with the youth in your community. Maybe you are doing all this technical analysis all the time as a consultant, but you would love to go and spend some time and imagine with the community what is possible. And so it doesn't matter if it's a current brownfield site and you want to just capture with your artistic eye what's there, or maybe it's a site that you know about, that you frequent and really get to experience what's possible and share that with us. And so we have a $500 first prize. And the judges will be at the California Land Recycling Conference, which is in Carson, California. I know that it's in Southern California, but we'd love to have you there, especially if you are either have projects that you want to share. We're looking for people to speak, as well as just getting ready for this next round. Ignacio, I'm curious to see. He does a brownfield sing-along there. And then we have a bunch of different presenters on a lot of, so we can really take a deeper dive than we're going to be doing today. And we do have scholarships as well. So I know that it's further away, but we do have scholarships. So please reach out to us to let us know if you'd like to join us. And then now I'd like to hand it over to Nova so she can talk about what's going on at the federal level.
Great. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I am going to kind of take a little bit of a step back. And by way of overview, want to talk about the really unique place and time where we are right now, and that this is a great time to build momentum because of the additional funds that we have. Then I'm going to talk about our grants, which, as Natalie said, the EPA brownfields grants really parallel what the state is doing. So I'll spend a little bit more time talking about our technical assistance, because our free technical assistance is also a really great way for communities or nonprofit groups to begin to access our larger grant funding if that's a good fit for them. And then and also to really talk about how we encourage creative solutions, recognizing that every community and every property is unique. And at EPA, we like to say that we're the program that likes to say yes. So you'll find that at EPA, we are among the least bureaucratic bureaucrats you'll probably ever encounter. And we're really excited to work with you. And so by way of closing it out, I would want to give a couple of tips on success, which I think really builds on the recommendations of panel one this morning about both having focus, a catalyst site, but then also really having broad stakeholder involvement. So, just the bipartisan infrastructure law is a huge investment nationally, and at EPA it is really also very significant as well. So it not only helps us advance our protection of human health and the environment, but it's also really going to help us create jobs and also promote climate resiliency. So for EPA overall, as you see in this pie chart, we're getting $5 billion over 5 years, and the bulk of that money is going to water and wastewater infrastructure. But you'll also see that almost 9% of that is going to cleanup and revitalization, and very importantly, including cleanup of Superfund sites, but also to our brownfields program. And this is tremendous for our brownfields program. We expect to get $1.5 billion over the next 5 years. So that bipartisan infrastructure law funding, in combination with our regular appropriation, we expect to have $370 million annually over the next 5 years. And so this is a big deal for us, because when our program first started in the 1990s, we were really focused on providing seed money to kind of help close that financial gap and get projects rolling again. But with this money that we're getting through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we can really both increase the amount of grants that we're awarding and increase, most importantly, the number of communities that we are engaging with. So we really, really want to reach out to organizations and communities that we've never worked with before as well, because as has been mentioned, there are communities throughout California and throughout our EPA Southwest Region 9 area that are really in need. So our regional administrator, Martha Guzman, mentioned it this morning, that the White House Justice 40 initiative really is an all-of-government effort to increase federal delivery of our federal investments to historically disadvantaged communities. And so this is both a way of achieving environmental and economic justice. And There are many programs throughout the federal government that have like started doing this work. The Brownfields program is one of those programs because since our inception, we really have focused on those historically underserved communities. And so, part of what we're going to be doing is expanding that work and also tracking it and being a model for other programs within our agency on how to do this type of work. Okay, so we really do, like I said, support environmental justice. We fund grants in communities that are underserved and or rural communities. We also require that community engagement be a part of all of our grants. So together, those two components really provide an opportunity to build that like grassroots involvement to fundamentally change communities that have seen only disinvestment over time. So it's really a way to help build wealth in communities and for the redevelopment that happens there to be the type of development the community wants to see. And so EPA, especially over the last several years, has really focused on equitable redevelopment. So ensuring that it's not just development, but when redevelopment comes to communities that have this historic impact from brownfield sites and other environmental cumulative impacts, that those residents are the ones that receive the benefit of that. And CCLR has actually been very involved with this work as well. They're one of the, I'll talk about it later, but they're one of the technical assistance providers on equitable development, so consider them a resource. Okay, so we have grants, we have technical assistance. I'm going to talk a little bit about our technical assistance. As I mentioned earlier, this is free technical assistance, and it basically breaks down into three categories. The first is identifying a brownfield. So Ignacio said, like, really, if there's been human activity there and it looks like it's a mess, it could be a brownfield. So our contractors will go out and they'll do the phase one. So they'll look at the property, do some historic record search, and determine whether or not it looks likely that there was some activity there that might have caused contamination. And if it looks like there could have been, then they will go and do sampling to determine whether or not, in fact, there is contamination. And if they say, yeah, it looks like you might have a problem here that it requires cleanup, we'll develop a document that looks at different alternatives for cleaning up that property and rough costs for doing that as well. So that's, we call that our targeted brownfields assessment program. The second type of technical assistance we have is very site-specific. Up there it says redevelopment planning, but in this context it's really pre-development planning. So it can cover everything from conceptual site design. A community says, we know we want something there, but we're not quite sure what would it look like. So if it's going to be new housing or community serving service, what could that possibly look like? We can also do things like market feasibility analyses. A community says we really want a grocery store there. So what would it take to financially, within that community, support a grocery store there? Or what are the different financing options we have for redevelopment? And or what are other funding sources that we can go to? So those are and then the third type is just like basic broad community assistance. And CCLR is one of the organizations that EPA funds for a community anywhere to call them up and say, hey, I've got this question about brownfields, or I want to learn more. And CCLR has a fantastic website and webinars that they often give where you can learn more and connect and broaden your partnerships. So that's a whole nother category of free technical assistance that EPA helps support. Okay, so quickly, why would you want to do it? It's so easy. It's like we have rolling applications. We have a lot of funding right now. We really, really want to encourage projects. There's no transfer of money. EPA contractors do the work. And then it's finally the outcome, the deliverable from this work is really a good foundation for communicating about your project, bringing in additional partners, and then also applying for additional funding. Okay, so our grants, just like Natalie talked about, they're really similar. The only things I'll add on, in addition to like the assessing and cleaning up, community engagement. We have funding for community engagement. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The redevelopment planning we talked about, We also have funding for job training, and we have a Cypress Mandela Training Center and Future Build are here today, and that funding is to support organizations that offer workforce development, to include as part of their workforce development certifications, environmental certifications that would allow their graduates to work on brownfield sites. And so in short, who's eligible? Governmental entities, tribes, and nonprofit organizations. I also want to say that as we're talking about brownfields and it's public money, these funds can be used, the assessment funds can be used both on publicly owned as well as privately owned properties. So just keep that in mind as well. So with our new funding, there's still a lot of unknowns, but I can tell you what is known, and that we are going to post our solicitation for our Brownfields Job Training Grant at the beginning of summer, with applications due late summer, and that the amount of that funding has gone up from $200,000 to $500,000. For kind of all of the rest of our Brownfields grants, that solicitation will come out probably on September and be due in November. That we know. And we know that the funding amount will go up. We just don't know how much yet. So please go to our website and join our listserv, and you'll get the latest information. You'll also get the latest information if you're already on CCLR's mailing list. Okay, so I know I just have a few minutes left, but I want to touch on this aspect of like what makes for a successful project. So focusing on a site and really having that broad base of community engagement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this property, this whole effort in Southwest Fresno that I've been really involved with, as many others have been as well. So here's the actual picture, which I really loved it this morning when Jim Becker said that his values are love, compassion, and justice, because I feel like that's what this picture shows right here. And just to really quickly go through, there's a corner property in Southwest Fresno. Southwest Fresno is one of those communities in the state that is environmentally overburdened, socially underserved, and low income. And St. Rest Baptist Church owns this property. It was formerly a gas station. There's a former meatpacking plant on the corner. And really the whole community came together with really this very deliberate, inclusive involvement of the community. And I think I just want to pause here for a moment to say, for those who are interested in potentially applying for EPA grants, I mentioned that community engagement is a requirement of our grant. When an applicant comes together, you can come together with, for example, a nonprofit that has expertise in that area, and that entity can be your community outreach partner. So this is something that Fresno has done in a subsequent grant, where they in fact have 3 local organizations, nonprofit organizations, the St. Rest Baptist Church, CDC, another organization called Every Neighborhood Partnership, who their role is that they really know how to, they are connected to the community, they know how to translate brownfields into something that makes sense to the community. And there's yet another organization, that I can't remember right now off the top of my head, who are also receiving brownfields grant funds to actually conduct this community outreach work. So I just want you to know that that can be a line item in your budget, as well as the stipends for community members who come and participate. So I just really want you to know that we understand how important that is, and that work can be funded through our EPA grants. Okay, so this is the corner property. They did this terrific thing. We talked about how long it takes to transform a brownfield site. They said, yeah, we know it takes a long time. So on that corner property, they created this pop-up plaza for community events and for farmers markets. But in the long term, they have a vision not just for that property, but for the whole South Elm corridor. And the St. Rest Baptist Church CDC is working on that. And in the interim, this is the former meat packing plant over here, and it's being cleaned up as we speak with EPA-funded dollars for the city of Fresno. And later this summer, it's going to become this food to share hub. So it's a community kitchen and food sharing hub. That is being funded through the state of California through their transformative climate Communities grant. So it's a really terrific success story. Okay, just 2 seconds on, we also have environmental justice grants. So as you're thinking about how to layer funding, think about other sources of funding. The Every Neighborhood Partnership that I mentioned in Fresno also received an EJ grant to work on community gardens, food security, and transforming brownfields into community gardens. So it's a great combination, excuse me, with all the other work we've done. And I think those are my takeaways. And we also have a big conference coming up, our National Brownfields Conference in August. So with that, I'll pass it over to Heather.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thank you to CCLR for arranging this. I have lived in California, in the Bay Area, since 1994 and always wanted to go to Freight and Salvage. And I've never been. So this is the beginning. I work at Enterprise Community Partners, and you might be wondering what that is. It's a national nonprofit intermediary, meaning we work with lots of different kinds of people. And we are a community development finance institution, which is basically the good guy bank. And we do policy work and technical assistance. So I braid that together for a team of with a team of people in Northern California, but we're a national organization. So we pull on our national resources as well. So I think my job here is to demystify some of the aspects of development for community serving needs, especially affordable housing. And I thought a good way to start with that would be to give you a sense of the development timeline, and then to give you a sense of where does the different kinds of money come in. This money that, the kind of resource that we're talking about here, the new EPA grant, this is really exciting because it's the kind of resource that can jumpstart things that hasn't been there before. So I'm very excited about that. Warning, if you're a developer, a nonprofit developer, you'll be really bored by what I have to talk about. So this is a good time to check your email. But if you're anybody else and you're curious about how does this crazy thing work, let's go. So there are different aspects of development, different phases. And actually, this slide is just capturing 4, and we've really it's like 12, and they get collapsed into these 4. But before this, there would have been city planning, regional planning, community planning. So the kind of work that CCLR folks and EPA, my EPA colleagues here, were talking about. So then you get to the pre-development planning work. Sounds like the EPA could have resourced a lot of that. Budgeting, project planning, feasibility scoping, doing some schematics, all of that kind of work. And even into some of the what we call financing, which is identifying where the resources eventually for construction are going to come from, and assembling what we call the capital stack, getting entitlements, that kind of work. So that's really fantastic because typically a developer, a nonprofit developer, is doing all of that on its own, using its own resources to do that, or taking out a loan from a good guy CDFI like ours and having to pay it back later. So to have that be grant funds is pretty catalytic. Then there's actual site acquisition, where you jump in the pool and say, okay, we're going to really swim, we're going to really do this. It's not just an idea, and we're going to commit. And then there's construction. So you got to be patient. All this takes years and years and years. And most of the time, the thing that is taking time and is very expensive to do is assembling the resources. So if we could cut that, we could save a lot of time and money. And then there's actual construction. So now you're thinking, all right, well, so we hear there's a lot of money out there. Why can't we do these things faster and more often? Well, because there are different kinds of money for different times in the phases and different aspects of the phases. So what I'm trying to convey here is what's called in my field a capital stack. Let's think of it more like soup, capital soup. You've got to have the broth first, and that is usually the kind of the work's been done. There's basically grant funding, seed funding, funding that is not something you owe back. that broth can attract additional resources, comforts banks and CDFIs and public agencies who have resources like the Strategic Growth Council to invest in their roles going forward. So the soft subsidy debt is really critical. Then there's the hard debt. That's the conventional lending. I saw my friend Trina here from Union Bank. That's where banks typically come in, and a traditional construction loan is made. And then there's equity, which is a dog-eat-dog world of trying to get low-income housing tax credits or new markets tax credits, and in some cases, resources from a public entity like the Strategic Growth Council, if you've got a project near transit. Anyway, these are, I won't go into all the nitty-gritty of all of this, but each one of these are relying on a sector to take a risk in a project, and or partners across sectors to do risk take to invest and jump in the pool together. And so there's a whole lot of kind of figuring out for a long time who's real and who's just kind of checking it out. It's a little bit like dating apps. Like, people are swiping right and going, yeah, I'm interested, but they're not necessarily committing until a lot of other things start to happen. So one might think that a project is coming forward and is getting more real, but a lot of things could happen along the way, and that's where the metaphor of chutes and ladders starts to come in. So what a developer is looking for is authentic partners with integrity who are going to be there for a long time to stay in as partners and through all of these different phases. And they're all looking to each other to make sure that trust is really there, and that if things don't work out, there are assets to make up for it. So that's the simplest way I can describe it at this moment in time. But at some point in time after all of that happens, we start to see real projects. So I just wanted to provide some hope that with patience and all that kind of goodwill and smarts and commitment, that you can get things like the Tassafaronga Village that's here in Oakland. This is something that is 7.5 acres that really needed to be cleaned up. The full project cost, and this is back then, this sort of thing, that was June 2010. Now we're 12 years later. The project cost would have gone way up. But this is an outdated public housing and abandoned factory with unused train tracks. As you can imagine, pretty dirty. Then, through an older EPA grant, lots of work happened with exploring the contamination and then remediating, and making sure that with the demolition, the construction debris was not just going into a landfill, but much of it could be recycled. And then, voila. After a lot of patience, a real place emerged that includes nonprofit, mission-oriented service providers, affordable housing, and Habitat for Humanity's got ownership projects in there, sweat equity projects, so that people from the community can own townhomes. So I see this as all very hopeful, that this new money is available. And I just wanted to clarify something. So when you're talking about the $370 million per year over 5 years, is that in California?
No.
Okay. So we get to it's still good.
It's still good.
It's still good. Okay. It's some broth. All right. It's like stone soup, but we can do this. Okay. Anyway, thank you. You want to talk about the soccer park?
Yes, and maybe Nova can chime in too. So that project was a tax credit project.
The Tassafaronga?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we wanted to come up with another type of project, which a bit more complex, a new markets tax credits. I still don't understand how it works, but this project was one of those.
Oh, I can explain that part.
All right. Okay. So you can explain that part.
Yeah.
But this is a project which, again, also got an EPA grant, but they did it backwards. They got the capital stack done before they applied for an EPA grant. Usually, you get the EPA grant first, or you plan for it ahead. This one, they came to the EPA grant very late because they already had grants from everywhere. They even had the new markets figured out, but they discovered that they actually had more cleanup necessary. So they applied for a cleanup grant, and they got from this is about 8 years ago. But again, this is an example of, just press the slide, a former rail track, and I think a new markets tax credit deal needs a cash flow in order to make it. It's kind of a loan, but it has a grant component, which again Heather can explain. But this was, they're not really buildings here, but they have concessions. So the new markets, I think, is funded through concessions, and I think you can pick up from here. One of you.
Well, did you want to? Oh, okay, back. Let's get the inspirational soccer field there.
Right. Yes. So this is again a deal where there wasn't a building. There was operations, there are memberships. I think there are rentals, and that's what funded the collateral. That's what paid back the loan for the new markets tax credits, as I understand it. So that's really the lesson here, is that you can even build a park. Park doesn't have to be all grants. There are some operations there. When you have a community facility, there's either, you have government grants, you have fee for service and other cash flow that you can use for the financing instruments that are necessary to fill in the gap. And many of these financial instruments have grant components, or if you get a loan, maybe you can get a grant somewhere else. I think that's the way the stew gets done, and we get to partake. So
I think you did a great job. What else do you need to know? It's money, you have to pay it back, but it's friendly money, so it's patient and has good terms.
And I can add a few other things about this project. It's really a great project. The city of San Pablo also received an EPA assessment grant, which helped to assess the site originally before the cleanup grant. And that Richmond Build is a job training workforce development entity that receives EPA funding, and one of their graduates actually worked on the redevelopment, the cleanup and redevelopment of this property. And then finally, this property is in the city of San Pablo, and it is San Pablo itself is a very underparked community with a large Hispanic Latinx community that loves soccer. And so this is a huge amenity for the community, but it's also been one of those catalyst sites to help really reinvigorate Rumrill Boulevard. And the city's doing a lot of other work around traffic calming and having more bike and pedestrian friendly amenities along that corridor. So just to add to why this is also a really good example. Yep. Do you want me to stay here? Sure. So, all right. Okay. So now we're in Q&A. So we're happy to answer any questions if there are some immediately. And if not, I can start off just by asking each of you from your experience, what do you see as making a successful project? What are some of the key elements let's maybe start, so we're talking about grants and grant funded or with partners. What makes for a successful project?
Well, you need a key local partner and perhaps champion or champions. It's harder actually these days, unfortunately, because at least for California cities, the champions, which are either the community development department, or we don't have redevelopment agencies anymore, which are actually driving these projects when we had them. So having some other anchor there, as well as local community partners who could be the champions for your projects.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, since I've been on so many of these technical assistance calls for ECRG. It's just, you can really see the range between organizations that have more resources than others, and organizations who have, cities who have that political will to do that community engagement and have been building that trust. and, you know, applying for these other planning grants. I know TCC's been mentioned a couple times since it is in high Cal Enviro screen areas, and other grants like that, other initiatives that they've done the legwork to build the trust and to identify projects, and also leaning on people. You know, some organizations don't know about, you know, all the things that Heather just talked about. And so just really having good development partners that take the time to listen. And I think that just goes all the way around. And also consultants that are willing, you know, there's a lot of technical parts of brownfields, and having those connections of, I've had some people say, well, oh, this looks really cool, we want to do phytoremediation. And here in the East Bay, what consultants can we talk to? Like, just even at that most basic level. And so I think really there's a lot of weaving to be done, a lot of opportunity. So I think that's really important.
Great. And I'll just add one more thing. I know Margo has a question as well. Is that, you know, it's always the start early. Like, it seems like, oh my God, fall is so far away. But to really put together a high scoring proposal really does take a lot of work. And I really meant it in terms of, like, please access me and my other colleagues at the EPA and CCLR as well. And they haven't really talked about it, but one of the other roles that CCLR plays for our EPA grants is they will, when we get close to or in the proposal writing period, they will review your draft proposal and give you feedback on what's strong and where you need to provide more information. And so, but they only can do that like right in the few months before it's due. So there's a lot of resources to access. We can kind of brainstorm with you about what's a good fit. So yes, so please just check in with us as soon as you can. Margo. Okay, so I'll just recapture the question, and Margo, tell me if I got it wrong. But just that with the infrastructure money, there's a lot of funding overall. It's difficult for either cities or nonprofits to really effectively grant write, because we're also stretched so thinly. So how can we get the word out a little bit more about how to tie all these resources together and submit really compelling applications for funding? Is that right?
I'll give you an example of something that we did 5 or 6 years ago, and it seems to be working, and so maybe something could be set up like this with an appropriate organization. So when the Strategic Growth Council came out with its program called Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities, that would be taking cap and trade resources and funneling a percentage of those for the state, a percentage of those to affordable housing that would be located near transit for infrastructure and affordable housing gap financing. This was all new to the field, and it wasn't something that a developer on its own could do, because it required partnerships with a transit agency in a city. And the cities couldn't do it because they were maxed out, and transit agencies were like, huh? Affordable housing? That's not what we do. So, foreseeing that, we shaped a team of what's now grown to be 5 people in my office and a cadre of 10 consultants around the state, so that when cities or transit agencies and affordable housing developers are contemplating putting affordable housing near transit, BART, AC Transit, Caltrans, SMART, all of that, and all throughout the whole state, they come together with a member of my team and one of their appropriate consultants, and help teach them how to do it themselves. Or in the case of some cities we all know, we actually just do it as extension of their staff. It's a pretty technical thing, and so it's not a beauty pageant with a nice story application. It is a very serious prove how you're going to bring down greenhouse gas emissions thing, and there's a game to be played to do that that's thicker than chess. So it's just sort of, a crew that's accessible, and we're on contract with the state to do it, and a crew that's, figured out how to, kind of like in a restaurant, like you come in, you say, this is what I need, I'd like a table for 6, and I'd like it near the window, and make it work, and make sure you get what you need all along the way. It's kind of a partnership. So something like that, rather than to think, oh, we've got to have a new person in every single city who's trained to do this, and it just that's too much to ask of our field right now.
Yeah, again, with the loss of redevelopment, it's kind of hard now to get the right person. It's usually the redevelopment persons who try to get, because they're brick and mortar people generally, but they did a lot of planning too. And so we've lost that connection between the planners to implementation. And Heather was just bringing something up where we need, the main capital communities have, and this is any kind of community, is the land. And if you don't have land, it's hard to get a project. And cities used to buy land. They can't buy land anymore. They don't have it, or they're trying to. Most of it's already dedicated for housing because of, redevelopment dissolution. But again, getting that component of land back into the equation so that communities have access to them and that they can get funded and financed is a very high leap, because cities don't buy land anymore. and it's a very competitive market. So that's a big question mark. We haven't figured that out. I just came up with an idea for Heather. She asked a question earlier today, and I think you might be looking back into an era where California cities need land banks or land trusts in order to make these projects work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would also add that absolutely finding the right person is key. So like Ignacio said, the redevelopment agencies, we know what a brownfield is. We know how the system works. We can do that. I would also say that community members who are living in neighborhoods that are impacted by brownfields, they know every day what the impacts to their health, to their community is. And so what I would hope is that, part of our outreach, I mentioned we really want to engage more communities that we've not worked with in the past, is that if we can connect with nonprofit groups who say, yes, I know what you're talking about, that's my lived experience, and that those nonprofit groups then have connections maybe with their city council or members who represent them, or other people within the city who they know, they have a connection with, who understand what they're working towards, that's sort of the beginning of a partnership that would make for a very successful grant application. But so it's really finding the people who understand it, have the passion for it, and want to see it through. There's a couple of other questions back there. Go ahead. Yes, okay, so the question was about brownfields and rising groundwater, especially for communities that are along shorefronts. So a few things. In the Bay Area, there is a coalition. It is, might not get the full name correct, but it's the Coalition to Clean Up Contaminated Shorelines. And EPA has also funded work looking exactly at that issue. DTSC has been a big partner in looking at toxic tides. If you do a search for toxic tides, you'll find that. And as you probably know, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission has also done a lot of work looking at just bay level rise in the Bay Area with climate change, and then what that means for shoreline properties that are contaminated. So the short answer is yes, we do recognize that it is a significant issue, that those communities are the flat land communities that were talked about with our keynote speaker. And we absolutely encourage applications around addressing these contaminated properties. So there is awareness, and it is a significant issue, and a significant issue for low-income and historically underserved communities. Yeah, Ignacio.
Yes, and actually, CCLR helped the city of Pittsburgh with their grant applications that address these. And, if we knew the answer, we'd be talking about it now. It hasn't been figured out yet, as far as I understand, because it's both, it relates to legacy in contamination that's in the ground, and the engineering solution to keep them there and safe. Because bringing the contamination somewhere else probably actually has more impacts, because you not only dig it out, you transport it and bring it to somebody else's community. So it's a long. I think it's a long process. It will take some kind of mitigations and credits and that kind of stuff. But that's a discussion to have now, because we have to start talking about it now, as opposed to letting that problem, kicking the can down the road. I mean, CCLR has been, I wouldn't say participant, but we've been aware of many brownfields projects that do have encapsulated brownfields on the Bayshore. So it's going to become more prominent in the next few years.
Yeah, and I'll just also add that, remember our brownfields grants are to help identify brownfields. There are a lot of known properties along the Bayshore that people know they're contaminated, right? So our brownfields grants may or may not be able to assist with those, but our grants are also a way to find out whether there are other properties there, whether or not they are contaminated or not. I think I saw another question.
Maybe one last thing before a question is that many of these are legacy sites that brownfields funds cannot touch. Some of them are RECRA, or some of them are TOSCA or Superfund. So there's some kind of barrier there to discussing these.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that, it really depends on the climate action plans or what the goals of the community are. So for some places, right, there's really high levels of heat, like Southern California. Or maybe over here it's toxic tides or wildfires, which we did have a special designation for wildfires, impacted communities in the ECRG grant. And so sometimes, it looks like parks districts who have done that work to identify sites to create more tree canopy, or do more stormwater infrastructure, or all the different, all the different things that can go into these plans. And so it really looks different, and depending on the community and what they've identified. And then there are some places who, we've seen cultural centers and health clinics and really great services for the community. And some people are also planning, like, where do we want to put cooling centers, and where do we want to put other climate resource, centers, resiliency hubs and things like that, which is more on the reuse side. But definitely these are the same communities that need these also have brownfield sites. And so it's just really, I think we have to work together to be as creative as possible to really prepare for what's coming and what's already happening.
Great, thank you. Other questions? So the question is about the timing of the DTSC cleanup, the brownfields grants.
Yeah, we just finished the first round, and DTSC is reviewing applications. And, as I mentioned, we do want to evaluate, do more targeted outreach. There was so much to do to launch this initiative. And we're hoping, DTSC says definitely by January, the second round, but it could be sooner. So it's really their call, but please sign up for our email list so we can let you know. And, we're here today and at CalRC and all to start the conversations to get this going. So, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. So the question was about how this type of work can leverage SB 1000. Because Ignacio had mentioned land trusts, and what other types of new policy could help.
Okay, so the brownfields grants, typically, again, you're dealing with the real estate, but you can do some outreach. And as far as SB 1000, since you're doing the EJ element of a general plan, you have to tie whatever activity you're discussing to what happens on the ground. And, since it's a policy document, it's... you could probably, maybe do an EJ grant perhaps, so you can identify facilities that can go both into an EJ element and a climate action plan. Because again, climate action plan is another spot where you can talk about, okay, we need, I'm familiar with the LA County climate action plan, and they have goals and all the way down to projects. And I could identify about at least a quarter of the projects that I identified that actually are related to brownfields, that you could perhaps leverage some outreach and planning. But again, you have to tie that to the sites, to your site inventory perhaps. So you look at your inventory of sites that you could consider for those projects that could benefit the community, that address EJ and climate responses.
I just answer that having a clear public land policy for city-owned sites or transit-owned sites and school district-owned sites can clarify for developers who want to do the work what the path is going to look like, what the expectations are.
Right. And I'll add that in our EPA applications, we always ask how your proposed project aligns with existing planning documents. And the fact that all of that work has already been done, like you have very clearly identified those communities that have environmental justice concerns, and then perhaps they've also talked about what quality of life elements are really important to them to further, to improve. That's the type of information that we're looking for when you talk about then wanting to investigate brownfields in your community, and then that would actually tie back into like, you know, what is the future redevelopment goals of those underutilized properties. So I think there's quite a lot of leveraging that can be done with all of that work that you have already accomplished. I think we're just about out of time. Thank you all.
To our panelists, Ignacio, Natalie, Heather, and Nova. I'm going to give a round of applause. Thank you very much. And Natalie, could you just forward the slide? And I want to thank our partners. I want to thank all you attendees. Thank you for coming out and celebrating Earth Day morning. And our Earth is moistened now with a rain of a couple days into our live stream. Thank you very much for listening in. I want to thank our partners, which is Groundworks USA, who are community engagement specialists, and partners also and thank you for US EPA, for DTSC, of course, our panelists, and also to our funders, Wells Fargo, Union Bank, and more. Thanks to our keynote speaker, and Martha Guzman for making a special appearance. Again, thank you everybody who participated in the panelists, and thank you for coming. Happy Earth Day.